With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, new face. Love getting new contributors on, but he's from an old group of friends. He's a Young Voices contributor. He's up in Michigan at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, although for the purposes of this conversation, we will not hold that against him because it ain't his fault that Rich Rod went up there. Kareem Rafai, how are you, my friend? Thank you so much for joining the program.
I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
I'm good. I wish we didn't have to talk about this kind of a topic, but we do because it's the kind of world we live in. You're writing in the Detroit News about it. I want to preface it with this because you've already wrote this piece a few days ago. Just in the few days since you read it, it's all over the news. Protests, dissidents, crackdowns on protests, how authoritative regimes like China, like Vladimir Putin, like others, are extending their reach into Western nations to try to cut down on dissent. This is something, obviously, you probably started researching this a week or two ago. This is something that's going to accelerate in the coming weeks, I think. Is that how it feels to you too?
For certain, yeah. And like I say in the piece, we're all aware that these regimes crack down on dissent within their own borders. But I really wanted to call attention to kind of this growing phenomenon of what Drew, the guy I interviewed, and I call the export of repression abroad.
That's a great term. You should trademark that real quick or maybe get the domain name for it because that's exactly what they're doing. We throw around terms like colonialism and imperialism, but then when you look at China, well, they're being imperialistic about things, but they're being imperialistic about repression and about controlling speech and narratives and things like this. That's part of what you're getting at here in the bigger picture before we get into the specifics of this piece. In the modern world with modern technology, they have to fight with information. They're trying to sequester free speech. That's nothing new in history, but it's very different in the modern age. And they're not just content to do it in their own countries. They're going worldwide with it.
Absolutely.
What's the first thing you hit on when you went to look at this? I want you to tell us the story because I think things like this, we get a little buzzwordy on them sometimes. Of course, the old thing about, a million people's a statistic, one man's a tragedy. You highlight this guy in England and he was protesting and he got snatched up, but it's also indicative of this tactic that's been used. Tell us the story of this guy and why you started out with it to bring attention to this issue.
For sure. So his name is Drew Pavlou. He is an Australian pro-democracy activist. He's made headlines for a couple of years now. Famously, he was removed from Wimbledon after holding up a sign, I believe, that said, "Where is Peng Shuai?" That famous Chinese tennis player who lodged sexual assault allegations at a top CCP official. So he's been in the public eye for a while now, and I've gotten to know him recently pretty intimately. And a few months ago now, or a couple of weeks ago, he was protesting in front of the Chinese embassy in London. And essentially what happened was a fake bomb threat under his name was emailed to the embassy. The embassy called the police. He was arrested. He was in, jail for 24 hours, like no access to consular assistance. He was in a whole bunch of legal trouble. The authorities were not, believing his story that this was a fake threat. He was essentially trapped in London for almost a month because of court dates. He was told, if he left the country, he may be arrested. And all of this just sparking from him standing outside an embassy with a couple of flags, ended up with him being arrested for threatening to commit a terroristic act.
And the thing about this is, and as you detailed it, the reason we know this was probably a setup is because the Chinese officials, the CCP and their intelligence and their security apparatus, they've targeted him before. So the fact that he was just standing out there, they knew well and good who this guy was, and they made sure it was a very specific, oh, this is the guy that did that, right?
Absolutely. And the exact same thing happened to him again this week in Australia, another fake bomb threat under his name. But now finally, authorities have caught on that this is, a targeted campaign against him. So he's not facing really any legal trouble from what I know now. But yeah, it just continues.
The thing about this is almost like the swatting tactic we've seen in American domestic politics. But on an international level, this has extreme consequences. Like you said, he's an Australian, so he's a Commonwealth guy. He should be able to travel. This could prevent him from traveling. This is very much a way of trying to tap down dissent, because the reason they go after a high-profile dissenter like him is because if you can get him, then the rest are quiet. We just had on our program talking about Hong Kong with Francis Wei, and then they're like, look, when they took out the top 50 or 60 organizers, all the protests in Hong Kong stopped. This is a pattern. This is something the Chinese Communist Party has down to a science. They know what they're doing this, and the pattern is something we should see to see how it's reaching out worldwide, and you touch on that.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned with Hong Kong, diaspora communities have been targeted for a really long time now. Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese people, especially on college campuses too. There's, the CSSA, which is the Chinese Student Scholars Association, which, there's a bunch of accusations that the Chinese government uses that organization on campuses to spy on dissent from students. So Drew kind of also drew that to my attention as well, that a lot of the diaspora communities in the UK and in Australia have been constant targets by the CCP, even once they've left China's borders.
And what does he say when you talk to him? Again, put a personal face on this, because we understand the geopolitics of it. We understand the human rights issue part of it. Well, most people that are functional adults that aren't wicked understand it. There's some people in the world that don't. When you're talking to him, what comes across? Like, what drives people to keep dissenting like this? Is it the people he knows personally? Is it just the wrongness of it? When you're talking to somebody like that one-on-one, not through a news story, not through a written piece, not through propaganda videos and YouTube, both for and against, what is it that comes across?
Yeah, like you mentioned, he's made a lot of close connections with people from those diaspora communities. And when you talk to them and you hear their stories, it's impossible not to empathize. As a Syrian too, like, I'm a part of a diaspora community from an authoritarian country. And when I tell my story to people who are not Syrian, I see that kind of empathy in Drew as well, even though he's not Chinese and he's, from Australia, born and raised, from what I know. You can just really tell he has a lot of empathy, and he's heard a lot of personal stories from, Tibetans and Uyghurs, etc.
Let me ask you about that, because, Syria and Assad and Russia and ISIS, that was just a brutal mix of basically all the world's worst actors converging, and the Syrian people ended up paying a heavy, heavy price, a massive price in death in wiped out cities. We'll probably never know the actual death toll. When you're talking to somebody who maybe doesn't follow politics, especially world politics, and doesn't even know something like that even exists, how's it hit you? Do you feel do you just not want to talk about it? Do you feel a responsibility as somebody in a diaspora community of, I need to explain to them why this is so important? Talk about that, because I've talked to so many people in these kind of communities. We've had them on the show before, and they all talk about it. It's like, this isn't really what I want, but I feel a burden about this sort of thing. I feel like I'm representative of it. How do you carry that burden, and do you feel it?
I definitely feel like I have an obligation to speak up for people in Syria who never had the chance to, especially for my family as well. They've gone through a lot. And, I was privileged enough to be born in the United States. So it's kind of like a survivor's guilt kind of thing. If my parents didn't choose to immigrate here, I probably would have been born in Aleppo, and who knows where I would be right now. So it does kind of come out of not only a feeling of obligation, but I want to share my story and the story of other Syrians and what they've gone through, because, my ultimate goal is to make sure that what happened in Syria doesn't happen ever again anywhere else. And that's why I have a lot of empathy, for these diaspora communities from China and from Taiwan and from Hong Kong, because, their plight it's different, but it's similar. This, reverberating effect of authoritarianism. Even when you're diaspora, it still affects you every single day. So
Yeah, and what you're saying about survivor's guilt is the same thing a lot of those people have said when we've interviewed them and talked to them, or even talked to them offline, just prepping. Obviously, Syria is a terrible thing. When you see that's kind of the end game of it, though, where you just have leveled, literally, you talk about Aleppo, like just rubble for most of it, unfortunately. Talk about, for somebody who just can't draw the line, no matter how you explain it to them, is like the reason you have to stand up to a bomb threat in London, the reason you have to stand up to Putin in Ukraine before it gets to that shooting war, before you get to tens of thousands of dead, before you get to a level cities, this quieting of dissent is how that starts. You draw that straight line in your advocacy. You've done it on your Twitter account. You do it in this piece. But just explain to people that's why this is so important, because that is how, that crushing of dissent is what leads to those level cities every single time.
absolutely, yeah. It's not always the most attractive and appealing thing to, call out foreign human rights abuse when it's not trendy. You know what I mean? So Ukrainian activists have been talking about Ukraine since the annexation of Crimea, and they've been largely ignored. They've been warning us about Putin for years. Syrian activists, the exact same thing. We've been warning about Russia for years, largely ignored. And until Russia actually mobilizes a full invasion of a European country is when it becomes trendy and sexy to talk about, oh, Russia is so bad, we need to do something about Russia, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, if we had jumped to action like we should have years ago, we wouldn't be at the place where we are today, with entire cities in Ukraine and Syria being leveled and thousands, tens of thousands of people being dead.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're correct. Kareem Rafai joining us on Heard Tell. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We come back. There's more in this piece. He talks about Iran. We're going to talk some more about China. We're going to talk some more about dissidents and Russia. All three of those heavily in the news cycle right now. We're going to work through them with our friend Raheem Jig, Young Voices contributor. Great conversation, deep conversation, but an important one to have. Heard Tell continues right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell, continuing our conversation with Kareem Rafai. He's up in Michigan right now, but he's talking about dissent, talking about authoritarianism, talking about protesting them and the very real cost that protest can have. On that vein, we've got it right in the news right now as we're speaking, really, in Iran. We have massive protests, the death of a woman at the hands of the morality police, they call it. She died in custody, and especially the women and others are protesting back. They're getting killed in the streets for it. We've seen this before in 2019. We've seen it before other times in Iran where they'll do this really brutal crackdown. When you're talking about dissent and how important it is and protesting, how's it hit when you see something like this? Because, let's be honest here. Sometimes protesting gets a little performative, and there's actually a protesting industry. But when you see this kind of bravery, women ripping off their hijabs and cutting their hair in public and this sort of thing, boy, that really hits home on how important this stuff is to me. How's it hit with you, though?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they are the peak of bravery. People standing up in regimes as repressive as Iran's and, openly flouting, the most repressive laws. It really is inspiring. And that's why in this article, I talked to Drew specifically about Iran and the silencing of dissent in Iran and abroad. And the case of Masih Alinejad, who is a Iranian women's rights activist here in the U.S., who faced not even her first assassination attempt a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it really has come full circle that, just a couple of weeks after the assassination attempt of Masih Alinejad and also Salman Rushdie, that we have these mass protests in Tehran.
compare and contrast those two because hers you heard almost nothing about. And I watch a lot of news and I heard nothing about it. Rushdie obviously got international headlines. Of course, he's been under a fatah for 40 years now. So that one got a lot of headlines. Why do you think certain ones of those hit the headlines and certain one of them don't? Now, also, Rushdie's was on video, so that's part of it, to be fair. And he's a much higher profile. But the core problem, what the Iranian regime was trying to do there, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Exactly. So it doesn't matter how high of a profile the person is. We need to be paying attention to every act of Iranian-sponsored terror on our soil, whether it be a famous author like Rushdie or a prominent activist like Masih Alinejad. We need to be paying attention to Iran's actions on our own soil. It's a violation of our sovereignty. It's a violation of our freedoms. And it's honestly egregious that an Iranian American activist, she, I believe, is an American citizen, is at threat of being gunned down in her own home in New York because she said something negative about a regime thousands of miles away.
Now, to come back to China for a minute, we know Vladimir Putin has executed and tried to assassinate people through various poisonings and other methods. We know the Iranians have been doing it for decades. The Chinese are more subtle about this, but it's no less wicked and evil what they're trying to do with dissent. Their methods are different. Like, Russia invaded Ukraine. China's trying to do this, economically and influence-wise. They don't really want a shooting war. They because it's bad for business. But the spirit of authoritarianism, the same problem, the same human rights issues, it's all there. It's just wearing a different coat and using a different method, isn't it?
Absolutely. You're right. It's a lot more covert on the end of China. I think the bomb threat, the faux bomb threat in the case of Drew Pavlou is, one of the more open flouting of their anti-democratic activities abroad. But like I talked to Drew, most of their action is covert. So they have, people on college campuses reporting to them about Chinese students who are, talking about Tiananmen Square or criticizing the CCP. They have professors we've seen in the past few years that are conducting academic espionage. They're a lot more covert about it. They're not like Iran sending assassins to people's doors in New York City.
Now, you talked about talking to Drew about his struggle. You also talked to a Chinese-Australian dissident, Vicky. I'll let you pronounce the name because I'll butcher it too, who's been the subject of Chinese state media smear campaign and serial harassment. I got to imagine, although the case is different and the methods are a little different, boy, it sure sounds like a lot of the same things because the way you harass and crush dissent is pretty universal, isn't it? Tell us about her story like you did with Drew. Put a human face on that one.
I didn't speak with Vicky, but Drew is a close friend of hers. She's a pretty prominent anti-CCP activist who has been relentlessly harassed by agents of the CCP. Her personal text messages being publicized on Chinese social media, her personal devices being hacked, just systematic harassment. There's no other way to describe it. I can't even imagine being in the situation that she's been in. But yeah, her story is just one of many that Drew shared with me of Chinese diaspora communities and Chinese dissidents being relentlessly targeted by the CCP apparatus abroad.
Yeah, you also made a point to kind of draw these desperate threads together. The wannabe assassins of Rushdie and Alinejad, they're going to be brought to justice because they were caught. They were literally caught in the act. But when it's the CCP calling in a bomb threat, when it's them crushing dissent, when it's them using things like diplomatic immunity to cover their actions in foreign countries, we're not going to get a quick, clean justice in that way. So how do you fight back against it?
Absolutely. And I draw this, I draw attention to that in the piece because we need to start holding these regimes accountable for crimes they're committing essentially on our soil and against our own citizens. It's not enough to just prosecute their agents. We also need to start holding the governments that are the ones funding and sending these people out to harass American and Western citizens. That needs to be something that we peg to our diplomacy. How are we going to negotiate deals with someone like, Raisi in Iran when he's sending assassins to kill random American citizens. It's absurd.
Yeah, and the reason we don't do that is because, Iran is obviously a player in the Middle East trying to always keep that delicate balance going. We know the issues with them in Israel. We know the issues with them and the Saudis. It's a complicated thing. So that balance buys them a lot of their human rights violations. China buys theirs economically. People are afraid to upset. They want to do business with China, so they buy theirs economically. You just mentioned the president of Iran. We just had the incident in New York City. Christina Amanpour, the well-known reporter, refused to wear a headscarf to interview, and he stormed off mad and refused to do it, basically, or his staff did. That doesn't sound like a big protest compared to the economic stuff and the human rights stuff and peace in the Middle East. But what you're saying, little things like that publicly to leaders that make them lose face, which is something they do care about, I think that does matter. How does it land with you, though?
Absolutely. I'm more enthusiastic than anyone to see the now mainstreamed upheaval against the Iranian government right now in the US. And I hope it lasts because we can't go weak. There's no more time for weakness. Too many people have died at the hands of the Iranian regime for us to take a step back and give them a boatload of concessions. So seeing this mainstreamed upheaval against not only Raisi, but the government of Iran over what's been going on in the past week, it's really great to see.
Kareem Rafai joining us. Now, you've gotten to talk to dissidents like Drew. You've got a little bit of a network. You're from a diasporic community. Not everybody listening to that has those kind of connections. What can someone do to affect it just in their social media, in their conversations, in the discourse, in the way they talk about these things? Just kind of the average person who, doesn't have political connections and maybe doesn't think they have a dog in the fight other than maybe they do care about freedom. Tell them a few things they can do that actually affect change here. Is it in the way they talk? Is it following and platforming and echoing the dissidents that do get their message out? Give the normal folks a thing or two they can do, like on their social media, that would actually do some good here and not just yelling at the TV about how wrong it all is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the number one thing that someone who is not intimately connected to these issues can do is to fight the apathy. And the way that you fight apathy is continuing to talk about the human rights abuses that are happening, continuing to platform dissidents and the people who actually are being intimately affected by these anti-democratic actors, and fighting against the kind of everyday apathy of, well, that's thousands of miles away, it doesn't affect me, because in reality, it does. Every time you go to the pump, and the price is above $4, you can point to, the instability that's been caused by Russia. It's an everyday thing. It's for everyone. So you may think that you don't have a dog in the fight, but in the end, you do. You may not be as intimately connected as someone, in Kiev or someone in Aleppo or someone in a diaspora community, but you are being affected by the actions of these regimes every single day. And you should be putting an effort to making sure other people know that too.
Yeah, that's really well put, my friend. Kareem Rafai joining us. We're going to have you back because these issues are universal. They're not going away. They look like they're accelerating in a lot of ways. But I also take some hope here because I think the reason some of this is accelerating is because I think some of these regimes are legitimately scared, especially Putin, especially the Iranian regime. China's not going anywhere, but they obviously have a long-term plan that they worry about it. So we have to have hope because if they're worried, that means that there's hope. Till we get you back, though, let folks know where they can follow you. We're going to link to this piece. It's a great piece. There's a lot of links inside the piece. Make sure you read those as well. Read it for yourself. Share it with folks. Make up your own mind. We'll link to that in the show notes. Let folks know where they can follow you and what you have going on until they see you the next time we get you on Heard Tell.
I'm at Kareem Rafai on Twitter and Instagram. That's Kareem, like the basketball player, Rifai.
It makes it nice and easy. Good reference point, my friend. He's also a Young Voices contributor, so you'll be seeing him on all those platforms. We'll link to his page as well. Great stuff. Best of luck up in Michigan. I guess if you got to go somewhere up there, that's not too bad of a spot. We kid. Great information today. Important topic. Really enjoyed having you. We will have you back. Thank you so much for the time, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, new face. Love getting new contributors on, but he's from an old group of friends. He's a Young Voices contributor. He's up in Michigan at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, although for the purposes of this conversation, we will not hold that against him because it ain't his fault that Rich Rod went up there. Kareem Rafai, how are you, my friend? Thank you so much for joining the program.
I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
I'm good. I wish we didn't have to talk about this kind of a topic, but we do because it's the kind of world we live in. You're writing in the Detroit News about it. I want to preface it with this because you've already wrote this piece a few days ago. Just in the few days since you read it, it's all over the news. Protests, dissidents, crackdowns on protests, how authoritative regimes like China, like Vladimir Putin, like others, are extending their reach into Western nations to try to cut down on dissent. This is something, obviously, you probably started researching this a week or two ago. This is something that's going to accelerate in the coming weeks, I think. Is that how it feels to you too?
For certain, yeah. And like I say in the piece, we're all aware that these regimes crack down on dissent within their own borders. But I really wanted to call attention to kind of this growing phenomenon of what Drew, the guy I interviewed, and I call the export of repression abroad.
That's a great term. You should trademark that real quick or maybe get the domain name for it because that's exactly what they're doing. We throw around terms like colonialism and imperialism, but then when you look at China, where they're being imperialistic about things, but they're being imperialistic about repression and about controlling speech and narratives and things like this, that's part of what you're getting at here in the bigger picture before we get into the specifics of this piece. In the modern world with modern technology, they have to fight with information. They're trying to sequester free speech. That's nothing new in history, but it's very different in the modern age. And they're not just content to do it in their own countries. They're going worldwide with it.
Absolutely.
What's the first thing you hit on when you went to look at this? I want you to tell us the story because I think things like this, we get a little buzzwordy on them sometimes. Of course, the old thing about, a million people's a statistic, one man's a tragedy. You highlight this guy in England and he was protesting and he got snatched up, but it's also indicative of this tactic that's been used. Tell us the story of this guy and why you started out with it to bring attention to this issue.
For sure. So his name is Drew Pavlou. He is an Australian pro-democracy activist. He's made headlines for a couple of years now. Famously, he was removed from Wimbledon after holding up a sign, I believe, that said, "Where is Peng Shuai?" That famous Chinese tennis player who lodged sexual assault allegations at a top CCP official. So he's been in the public eye for a while now. And I've gotten to know him recently pretty intimately. And a few months ago now, or a couple of weeks ago, he was protesting in front of the Chinese embassy in London. And essentially what happened was a fake bomb threat under his name was emailed to the embassy. The embassy called the police. He was arrested. He was in, jail for 24 hours, like no access to consular assistance. He was in a whole bunch of legal trouble. The authorities were not, believing his story that this was a fake threat. He was essentially trapped in London for almost a month because of court dates. He was told, if he left the country, he may be arrested. And all of this just sparking from him standing outside an embassy with a couple of flags, ended up with him being arrested for threatening to commit a terroristic act.
And the thing about this is, and as you detailed it, the reason we know this was probably a setup is because the Chinese officials, the CCP and their intelligence and their security apparatus, they've targeted him before. So the fact that he was just standing out there, they knew well and good who this guy was, and they made sure it was a very specific, oh, this is the guy that did that, right?
Absolutely. And the exact same thing happened to him again this week in Australia, another fake bomb threat under his name. But now finally, authorities have caught on that this is, a targeted campaign against him. So he's not facing really any legal trouble from what I know now. But yeah, it just continues.
The thing about this is almost like the swatting tactic we've seen in American domestic politics. But on an international level, this has extreme consequences. Like you said, he's an Australian, so he's a Commonwealth guy. He should be able to travel. This could prevent him from traveling. This is very much a way of trying to tap down dissent, because the reason they go after a high profile dissenter like him is because if you can get him, then the rest are quiet. We just had on our program talking about Hong Kong with Francis Wei, and then they're like, look, when they took out the top 50 or 60 organizers, all the protests in Hong Kong stopped. This is a pattern. This is something the Chinese Communist Party has down to a science. They know what they're doing this, and the pattern is something we should see to see how it's reaching out worldwide, and you touch on that.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned with Hong Kong, diaspora communities have been targeted for a really long time now. Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese people, especially on college campuses too. There's, the CSSA, which is the Chinese Student Scholars Association, which, there's a bunch of accusations that the Chinese government uses that organization on campuses to spy on dissent from students. So Drew kind of also drew that to my attention as well, that a lot of the diaspora communities in the UK and in Australia have been constant targets by the CCP, even once they've left China's borders.
And what does he say when you talk to him? Again, put a personal face on this, because we understand the geopolitics of it. We understand the human rights issue part of it. Well, most people that are functional adults that aren't wicked understand it. There's some people in the world that don't. When you're talking to him, what comes across? Like, what drives people to keep dissenting like this? Is it the people he knows personally? Is it just the wrongness of it? When you're talking to somebody like that one-on-one, not through a news story, not through a written piece, not through propaganda videos and YouTube, both for and against, what is it that comes across?
Yeah, like you mentioned, he's made a lot of close connections with people from those diaspora communities. And when you talk to them and you hear their stories, it's impossible not to empathize. As a Syrian too, like, I'm a part of a diaspora community from an authoritarian country. And when I tell my story to people who are not Syrian, I see that kind of empathy in Drew as well, even though he's not Chinese and he's, from Australia, born and raised, from what I know. You can just really tell he has a lot of empathy, and he's heard a lot of personal stories from, Tibetans and Uyghurs, etc.
Let me ask you about that, because, Syria and Assad and Russia and ISIS, that was just a brutal mix of basically all the world's worst actors converging, and the Syrian people ended up paying a heavy, heavy price, a massive price in death in wiped out cities. We'll probably never know the actual death toll. When you're talking to somebody who maybe doesn't follow politics, especially world politics, and doesn't even know something like that even exists, how's it hit you? Do you feel do you just not want to talk about it? Do you feel a responsibility as somebody in a diaspora community of, I need to explain to them why this is so important? Talk about that, because I've talked to so many people in these kind of communities. We've had them on the show before, and they all talk about it. It's like, this isn't really what I want, but I feel a burden about this sort of thing. I feel like I'm representative of it. How do you carry that burden, and do you feel it?
I definitely feel like I have an obligation to speak up for people in Syria who never had the chance to, especially for my family as well. They've gone through a lot. And, I was privileged enough to be born in the United States. So it's kind of like a survivor's guilt kind of thing. If my parents didn't choose to immigrate here, I probably would have been born in Aleppo, and who knows where I would be right now. So it does kind of come out of not only a feeling of obligation, but I want to share my story and the story of other Syrians and what they've gone through, because, my ultimate goal is to make sure that what happened in Syria doesn't happen ever again anywhere else. And that's why I have a lot of empathy, for these diaspora communities from China and from Taiwan and from Hong Kong, because, their plight it's different, but it's similar. This, reverberating effect of authoritarianism, even when you're diaspora, it still affects you every single day. So.
Yeah, and what you're saying about survivor's guilt is the same thing a lot of those people have said when we've interviewed them and talked to them, or even talked to them offline, just prepping. Obviously, Syria is a terrible thing. When you see, that's kind of the end game of it, though, where you just have leveled, literally, you talk about Aleppo, like just rubble for most of it, unfortunately. Talk about, for somebody who just can't draw the line, no matter how you explain it to them, is like, the reason you have to stand up to a bomb threat in London, the reason you have to stand up to Putin in Ukraine before it gets to that shooting war, before you get to tens of thousands of dead, before you get to a level cities, this quieting of dissent is how that starts. You draw that straight line in your advocacy. You've done it on your Twitter account. You do it in this piece. But just explain to people that's why this is so important, because that is how, that crushing of dissent is what leads to those level cities every single time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not always the most attractive and appealing thing to, call out foreign human rights abuse when it's not trendy. You know what I mean? So Ukrainian activists have been talking about Ukraine since the annexation of Crimea, and they've been largely ignored. They've been warning us about Putin for years. Syrian activists, the exact same thing. We've been warning about Russia for years, largely ignored. And until Russia actually mobilizes a full invasion of a European country is when it becomes trendy and sexy to talk about, oh, Russia is so bad, we need to do something about Russia, et cetera, when in reality, if we had jumped to action like we should have years ago, we wouldn't be at the place where we are today with entire cities in Ukraine and Syria being leveled and thousands, tens of thousands of people being dead.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're correct. Kareem Rafai joining us on Heard Tell. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We come back. There's more in this piece. He talks about Iran. We're going to talk some more about China. We're going to talk some more about dissidents and Russia. All three of those heavily in the news cycle right now. We're going to work through them with our friend Raheem Jig, Young Voices contributor. Great conversation, deep conversation, but an important one to have. Heard Tell continues right after this. Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to the District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. Welcome back to Heard Tell, continuing our conversation with Kareem Rafai. He's up in Michigan right now, but he's talking about dissent, talking about authoritarianism, talking about protesting them and the very real cost that protest can have. On that vein, we've got it right in the news right now as we're speaking, really, in Iran. We have massive protests, the death of a woman at the hands of the morality police, they call it. She died in custody, and especially the women and others are protesting back. They're getting killed in the streets for it. We've seen this before in 2019. We've seen it before other times in Iran where they'll do this really brutal crackdown. When you're talking about dissent and how important it is and protesting, how's it hit when you see something like this? Because, let's be honest here. Sometimes protesting gets a little performative and there's actually a protesting industry. But when you see this kind of bravery, women ripping off their hijabs and cutting their hair in public and this sort of thing, boy, that really hits home on how important this stuff is to me. How's it hit with you, though?
Absolutely. I mean, they are the peak of bravery. People standing up in regimes as repressive as Iran's and, openly flouting, the most repressive laws. It really is inspiring. And that's why in this article, I talked to Drew specifically about Iran and the silencing of dissent in Iran and abroad. And the case of Masih Alinejad, who is a Iranian women's rights activist here in the U.S., who faced not even her first assassination attempt a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it really has come full circle that, just a couple of weeks after the assassination attempt of Masih Alinejad and also Salman Rushdie, that we have these mass protests in Tehran.
Compare and contrast those two, because hers you heard almost nothing about. And I watch a lot of news and I heard nothing about it. Rushdie obviously got international headlines. Of course, he's been under a Fatah for 40 years now. So that one got a lot of headlines. Why do you think certain ones of those hit the headlines and certain one of them don't? Now, also, Rushdie's was on video, so that's part of it, to be fair, and he's a much higher profile. But the core problem, what the Iranian regime was trying to do there, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Exactly. So it doesn't matter how high of a profile the person is. We need to be paying attention to every act of Iranian-sponsored terror on our soil, whether it be a famous author like Rushdie or a prominent activist like Masih Alinejad. We need to be paying attention to Iran's actions on our own soil. It's a violation of our sovereignty. It's a violation of our freedoms. And it's honestly egregious that an Iranian American activist, she, I believe, is an American citizen, is at threat of being gunned down in her own home in New York because she said something negative about a regime thousands of miles away.
Now, to come back to China for a minute, we know Vladimir Putin has executed and tried to assassinate people through various poisonings and other methods. We know the Iranians have been doing it for decades. The Chinese are more subtle about this, but it's no less wicked and evil what they're trying to do with dissent. Their methods are different. Like, Russia invaded Ukraine. China's trying to do this, economically and influence-wise. They don't really want a shooting war. They because it's bad for business. But the spirit of authoritarianism, the same problem, the same human rights issues, it's all there. It's just wearing a different coat and using a different method, isn't it?
Absolutely. You're right. It's a lot more covert on the end of China. I think the bomb threat, the faux bomb threat in the case of Drew Pavlou is, one of the more open flouting of their anti-democratic activities abroad. But like I talked to Drew, most of their action is covert. So they have, people on college campuses reporting to them about Chinese students who are, talking about Tiananmen Square or criticizing the CCP. They have professors we've seen in the past few years that are conducting academic espionage. They're a lot more covert about it. They're not like Iran sending assassins to people's doors in New York City.
Now, we talked about talking to Drew about his struggle. You also talked to a Chinese Australian dissident, Vicky. I'll let you pronounce the name because I'll butcher it too, who's been the subject of Chinese state media smear campaign and serial harassment. I got to imagine, although the case is different and the methods are a little different, boy, it sure sounds like a lot of the same things because the way you harass and crush dissent is pretty universal, isn't it? Tell us about her story like you did with Drew. Put a human face on that one.
I didn't speak with Vicky, but Drew is a close friend of hers. She's a pretty prominent anti-CCP activist who has been relentlessly harassed by agents of the CCP, her personal text messages being publicized on Chinese social media, her personal devices being hacked, just systematic harassment. There's no other way to describe it. I can't even imagine being in the situation that she's been in. But yeah, her story is just one of many that Drew shared with me of Chinese diaspora communities and Chinese dissidents being relentlessly targeted by the CCP apparatus abroad.
Yeah, you also made a point to kind of draw these desperate threads together. The wannabe assassins of Rushdie and Alinejad, they're going to be brought to justice because they were caught. They were literally caught in the act. But when it's the CCP calling in a bomb threat, when it's them crushing dissent, when it's them using things like diplomatic immunity to cover their actions in foreign countries, we're not going to get a quick, clean justice in that way. So how do you fight back against it?
Absolutely. And I draw this, I draw attention to that in the piece because we need to start holding these regimes accountable for crimes they're committing essentially on our soil and against our own citizens. It's not enough to just prosecute their agents. We also need to start holding the governments that are the ones funding and sending these people out to harass American and Western citizens. That needs to be something that we peg to our diplomacy. How are we going to negotiate deals with someone like, Raisi in Iran when he's sending assassins to kill random American citizens? It's absurd.
Yeah, and the reason we don't do that is because, Iran is obviously a player in the Middle East trying to always keep that delicate balance going. We know the issues with them in Israel. We know the issues with them and the Saudis. It's a complicated thing. So that balance buys them a lot of their human rights violations. China buys theirs economically. People are afraid to upset. They want to do business with China, so they buy theirs economically. You just mentioned the president of Iran. We just had the incident in New York City. Christina Amanpour, the well-known reporter, refused to wear a headscarf to interview, and he stormed off mad and refused to do it, basically, or his staff did. That doesn't sound like a big protest compared to the economic stuff and the human rights stuff and peace in the Middle East. But what you're saying, little things like that publicly to leaders that make them lose face, which is something they do care about, I think that does matter. How does it land with you, though?
Absolutely. I'm more enthusiastic than anyone to see the now mainstreamed upheaval against the Iranian government right now in the US. And I hope it lasts because we can't go weak. There's no more time for weakness. Too many people have died at the hands of the Iranian regime for us to take a step back and give them a boatload of concessions. So seeing this mainstreamed upheaval against not only Raisi, but the government of Iran over what's been going on in the past week, it's really great to see.
Kareem Rafai joining us. Now, you've gotten to talk to dissidents like Drew. You've got a little bit of a network. You're from a diasporic community. Not everybody listening to that has those kind of connections. What can someone do to affect it just in their social media, in their conversations, in the discourse, in the way they talk about these things? Just kind of the average person who, doesn't have political connections and maybe doesn't think they have a dog in the fight other than maybe they do care about freedom. Tell them a few things they can do that actually affect change here. Is it in the way they talk? Is it following and platforming and echoing the dissidents that do get their message out? Give the normal folks a thing or two they can do, like on their social media, that would actually do some good here and not just yelling at the TV about how wrong it all is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the number one thing that someone who is not intimately connected to these issues can do is to fight the apathy. And the way that you fight apathy is continuing to talk about the human rights abuses that are happening, continuing to platform dissidents and the people who actually are being intimately affected by these anti-democratic actors, and fighting against the kind of everyday apathy of, well, that's thousands of miles away, it doesn't affect me, because in reality, it does. Every time you go to the pump, and the price is above $4, you can point to, the instability that's been caused by Russia. It's an everyday thing. It's for everyone. So you may think that you don't have a dog in the fight, but in the end, you do. You may not be as intimately connected as someone, in Kiev or someone in Aleppo or someone in a diaspora community, but you are being affected by the actions of these regimes every single day. And you should be putting an effort to making sure other people know that too.
Yeah, that's really well put, my friend. Kareem Rafai joining us. We're going to have you back because these issues are universal. They're not going away. They look like they're accelerating in a lot of ways. But I also take some hope here because I think the reason some of this is accelerating is because I think some of these regimes are legitimately scared, especially Putin, especially the Iranian regime. China's not going anywhere, but they obviously have a long-term plan that they worry about it. So we have to have hope because if they're worried, that means that there's hope. Till we get you back, though, let folks know where they can follow you. We're going to link to this piece. It's a great piece. There's a lot of links inside the piece. Make sure you read those as well. Read it for yourself. Share it with folks. Make up your own mind. We'll link to that in the show notes. Let folks know where they can follow you and what you have going on until they see you the next time we get you on Heard Tell.
I'm at Kareem Rafai on Twitter and Instagram. That's Kareem, like the basketball player, Rifai.
Great information today. Important topic. Really enjoyed having you. We will have you back. Thank you so much for the time, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Grace is joining us. Francis is joining us. They're both from the Dissident Project. Grace, real quick, we just heard her, more of her story and what's going on in Hong Kong. It's not just Hong Kong. We have multiple people in the Dissident Project from all over different parts of the world. The theme that goes across all of these, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's North Korea, authoritative dictatorships who need power and they have to crush dissent and they have to crush other people's freedoms to keep that power. This is universal through human history. It's always going to be this way throughout human history, I think. How do you tell that part of the story that, hey, this isn't just some ideological term we throw around on social media? This is a part of the human experience for as long as we have recorded human history. And it's happening right now to real life people that through technology you can talk to, like Francis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in addition to, the dissidents telling their personal stories, which is an incredibly important part of this, they also talk about the technical details of how these authoritarian governments begin, how they take over, how socialism leads to communism, the economic implications of these systems for the citizens of their home countries. And so it's not just that they're telling their personal stories, but they really are reaching back into history and talking about how these things happen, how people groups become oppressed, how countries fall into authoritarian rule.
And Francis, we know the history of how Hong Kong fell under authoritative rule. We know, it was British. Now the Chinese have control of it. What's the future? And I don't want to be bleak about it, but the Communist Chinese Party is very ingrained. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. What's the immediate future of Hong Kong? Are they going to get even more freedoms taken away? What's the status right now today? Because like we mentioned before, the Western media has kind of stopped covering it, unfortunately, since probably the 2019 where we had those visual things. What's been going on since then, and what do you anticipate in the near future?
Well, as I said, on a civil activity level, there's none. There's no protest going on in the streets. But then I also want to mention that I think there are still resistance among the people. You can't shut people's mouth like all of a sudden and erase their memories. I think that's something we can hold hope on. And when there is such a huge oppression that exists in the city, that's when arts start to evolve, and that's when creation starts to come out, and we see many people start to pay more attention to local arts and local music, and just everything that's coming out from Hong Kong, because they know that's what our national identity is contained to, and they start to embrace more about the local culture, and that's how they practice and how they really lift their identity out as a Hong Konger. So you see there are a lot of different art, different special, unique things that comes out from the city, and our part in Exile is to promote about it and to amplify that, because the people in Hong Kong, they do not get as much exposure and attention as they have before. And I think even now, like within arts, you can see people's voice they are continuing to speak up and to say the values they want to embrace. So when you look at little things and basically things that comes out from the city, it's just amazing. And I think that's the thing that we can look forward to. And who knows, like I think back in 2014, I didn't imagine that something as big as massive as the 2019 movement would happen. So perhaps we can have hope that in the future something like that could happen, even and something even bigger. We don't know. And I can only tell you that, for people like us outside, we have the responsibility to amplify their voice and to continue to bring attention to them. And that's why I'm with the Dissident Project, because I want to tell the story of Hong Kong, basically.
Are you aware of that as you do your advocacy? And I know we're talking with Grace, you know, the way you've built the Dissident Project, it's going to be very online. It's very multimedia. It's multi-platform, we call it, on purpose. Are you cognizant of that? It's like you don't really know what's going to break through, not just to Hong Kong, but the Chinese people themselves. I know they keep a real tight lock on the technology, but you never know what might get through. And you never know who might get to see it. And that little sliver, like for example, when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan and the CCP just absolutely freaked out, you know, we kind of say it's like, it's not just that they're free. That scares them to death because somebody might see that and they might see somebody that's free and they might see a country that's free and something. Are you really cognizant of that? It's like every time I do this, every time I make a YouTube video, every time I do an interview, you just never know what might slide through and inspire that one more person.
Yeah, absolutely. Like they would send millions of people online, like robots, to comment under a video and to basically create a huge backlash online against your video or anything that you do. And that's when you know, oh, this is something they care about and they're scared of. And so we would do that more. I can, you know, a lot of times sanctions does help. Sometimes when they're trying to do evil things and little things and they thought no one is going to pay attention to, and we reveal that truth, they are scared too. So we'll just continue to do that more often, you know.
Yeah, I've had a few run-ins with those state-sponsored tag Twitter accounts once or twice because I don't care. I say what I think of them, and they know exactly where I stand on that. Grace, you have to know that, though, when you put this project together, they are the CP propaganda online. It's very active. There's a lot of bots out there. They have a lot of malicious stuff out there. You got to be aware of that when you put this project together. It's like, this isn't just going to be us talking to kids. This is a worldwide audience, and there's some really bad people just going to be watching us and not liking what we're doing too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yes, we're very aware. And I think being strategic with our language has been really important for us, not only as we consider those different factors, which are huge, and the safety of our dissidents, which is huge, but also reaching as many people as possible, right? We want to reach people in the movable middle. We want to talk about human rights abuses. We want to talk about liberty. We want to use language that will be as accessible as possible for as many people as possible. So we're being very cognizant of all of those different factors.
Yeah, it's a tough road to hoe because you want to say certain things to people that are just that out and out wicked, but at the same time, you got to understand there's another audience. So God bless you for walking that hard line. We're going to take one more quick break. We come back. We're going to kind of wrap this up a little bit more about the Dissident Project. We're going to talk about those kids they're going to be talking to in the schools, the reactions, what it's like to talk to them, what it brings up in the people that do it. Because sometimes we just see the people standing in front of the room and you need to know what it feels like to stand up there. I've had to do that a little bit myself sometimes. More with Grace, more with Francis, as we continue Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell, talking to our good friends Grace and Francis, the Dissident Project. Francis, when you go to something like a school or even like a college or something like this, and you have that room full of people and they're just staring at you, you know you've got a message that matters. You know this is life and death stuff to the people of Hong Kong. What goes through your mind in that minute before you kind of get into your routine and the things you normally say, and you just got all those people staring at you, and do you feel the weight of it? Does it hit you like, oh, what am I doing here? This is not exactly what my life plan was.
Well, I would say all the activists or dissidents that come out from our country did not imagine that we're living the life that we're living right now. That's one thing. I have my own dream, and that's not something related to politics, obviously. And I didn't imagine myself would be standing in front of the classroom and talking to a bunch of students about Hong Kong. And but that's what I have to do, right? And so I remind myself what I'm here for, not just for my people. It's not like I am a great leader that it's like living a life against my will. It's really for myself and for people I care. And I have family and friends back home in Hong Kong, and those are the people that keep me fighting till now. So I just remind myself, like, this is what I'm here for, and I'm gonna do great. And if they're gonna stare at me continually, then I would be, I would just tell them, let's put yourself in my shoes and think about what it would be like to live a life that without freedom, a life that you would scare to death that one day the police are gonna knock on your door and take your parents away. That's it, and that's the life that many dissidents are living in, and people living under communist rule are facing. So once you tell that kind of scenario and that kind of story, you're going to capture their attention.
Yeah. I hate to correct guests. I rarely do it, but you're wrong, by the way. You are a great leader. Just so you know, and somebody tells you publicly. Great. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, we got Daniel Chang Contreras. We're talking the immigrant. I don't even know what we need an overarching term for this, because we have the Martha Vineyard part, we got the bus part, we got the vice president house part, we got the New York part, the DC part. Isn't that part of the problem, though, is because this thing unthreads so many different ways, and the stunts become the thing, and then that's all anybody ever talks about. And now they're, here in another day or two, everybody will forget about it and move on. Like you said, though, this is a constant problem.
Yeah, it is. According to Border Patrol, 50,499 encounters were from Venezuelans in fiscal year 21, 155,553 this fiscal year, which hasn't ended. And we already have approximately 300,000 Venezuelans who have requested temporary protected status. It is an ongoing problem, and it's an ongoing problem that has been caused by the Venezuelan the political situation back home, back in Venezuela. This is something, by the way, which I think, Andrew, is really important to point out here. And one of the things that really concerns me is the way Republicans have been framing the issue of Venezuelans. Because, of course, since these stunts are made to highlight the problem of the border, which is a disaster, and of course to highlight hypocrisy of Democrat majors and all that, which I understand, it's a political ploy that's a fair many points. The problem here is that Republicans are now confounding the Venezuelan issue with illegal immigrants, right? After years of they saying, oh, the Venezuelan situation is so bad, communism is so bad, socialism is so bad, this is what socialism causes to our country, it destroys the country, and the Venezuelan people are now suffering from it. And that was all good or great, and actually was true and empathetic. And they say the same thing about Cubans. Cubans are not refugees, are not illegal immigrants, or refugees, because they're escaping a communist dictatorship. Oh, but the Venezuelans who are also being ruled by a similar dictatorship, they are illegal immigrants, just because, of course, the ploy requires them to be illegal immigrants, right? So that's what actually concerns me quite a lot, that the Republican Party, who has been quite consistent on the way that characterized the Venezuelan crisis, now in these moments, because, of course, the political necessities dictate in that way, they changed a little bit the tune. It's like, oh, Venezuelans are no longer like kind of victims of communism, another illegal immigrants are coming to the country. That's something that I consider it's worrisome as a Venezuelan and as a conservative as well.
Here's the thing. Let's be adults here. When whoever planned this and I know DeSantis and Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis, they're getting the flack because these are their programs. They didn't handpick these folks. Somebody in their chain of command and their staffs did this. Somebody purposefully said, let's get the Venezuelans for this. They did that purposefully. They didn't get, folks from any other country. They didn't use Mexicans. They didn't use any other group. I know it's speculation. I don't think that's accidental. It can't be accidental. Of all the folks down there, they know the asylum process is more legally fraught. They know it's more complicated. They know that the situation of these folks is a little different. Why did they pick the Venezuelan folks for this, do you think? Because it's happened more than once now, so it's not accidental.
Yeah, it's happening a while. I mean, actually, the majority of people being bussed around, it's not like only Martha's Vineyard or the vice president's home. It's like majority of them are Venezuelans. I wouldn't know, as you said, it's speculative. I don't know the inner and outs and like the process it works, but my working theory is basically most Venezuelans who cross the border immediately ask for asylum. I mean, they cross the border and immediately ask for asylum because that's the way that migratory flow is working, right? So when you ask for asylum, of course, you have to report to government, basically, right? You have to report to border agents, you have to report to immigration officers in some ways. That makes the Venezuelan pool of migrants, of refugees, easier to detect, basically, than those from other countries that don't try to claim asylum and try to actually go into the country without being caught by immigration officers. That's what I think, first one. And the second one, of course, as you said, the situation is quite fraught. Venezuelans, we are very new at this, trying to get this, of crossing the border. This is not a history of Venezuelan crossing the U.S. border. So, of course, people who come here can be easily dissuaded to try to go and pick a bus. Maybe it works for them, actually. Maybe they want to go to New York, whatever. The situation is fraught. A lot of them probably don't know a lot of English. And, it's a bit easier to get them to agree. Probably a lot of them do agree and just want to go further north. And like they say, okay, I'll pick the free ride. So I think it's a combination of both factors. One, that the Venezuelan pool is easier to detect. That's my working theory. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's not true. It's just completely speculative. And the second one is, of course, the situation is a little bit more fraud. A lot of Venezuelans, it's the first time they're doing come to the United States. They don't have a lot of people who are trying to, it's just not a history, right, of Venezuelans trying to cross into the United States through the Rio Grande. So it's easier for them to believe anything, really, what they told.
The sad truth of this, Daniel Chang Contreras joining us. The sad truth of this is I think everybody got what they wanted out of this episode, the Martha's Vineyard episode. This Governor DeSantis, he got his national pub. The anti-immigration folks got to throw a big fit. The pro-immigration fans got to say, oh, look how well we treated these people before we, shipped them off to Cape Cod, which, by the way, that's been a refugee place for years and years and years. That's exactly where you put somebody like that. So that was all noise too, by the way. What do we do now? Because everybody got what they wanted out of this story, this is going to happen again. They're going to keep doing this. Everybody, both sides. They're going to keep doing this because everybody got what they wanted out of it. So what do we do next time? Because there's going to be a next time.
Well, that's something that really concerns me, is the fact that it will continue happening. Venezuelans are now part of the American political game, sometimes very political toxic game between Democrats and Republicans, and there will not be a policy. And that's something that I said in Twitter thread. It was in Spanish, but I'll try to translate it. The fact that this Martha's Vineyard episode, beside the hypocrisies of both parties and all that, shows that there is a lack of policy, a lack of coherent policy by the United States government to attend the biggest humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere, and it will continue going on this way. You will see more buses being shipped to Washington, to New York, to other blue cities. Blue cities will, do a photo up and say we treated them well and they shipped them off. But the reality is that Venezuelans will still be the victims after this. I mean, the consequences of this is that Venezuelan asylum seekers there's not a policy to take care of the Venezuelan refugee problem. And now that it's become politicized, there's even less chances for there to be a coherent policy response to the Venezuelan refugee crisis. A crisis that, and I really want to really point this out again and again and again and again, is not a unique American situation. It has been going on in the entire continent for years. 6.8 million people in the last 4 to 5 years. That's a quarter of the population. That's like 80 to 90 million Americans left in 4 years. That's the situation. That's it is almost at the same size as the Ukrainian and Syrian refugee crisis without a war. That's the size of the problem we're talking about. America's only get the little bit of it 4 years later, and it caught the American government and the political establishment off guard.
Yeah. To put a bow on this, you tweeted about this extensively. I'm going to paraphrase and condense this because this Twitter thread was in Spanish and a lot of us don't habla. So you tell me if I'm wrong on any of this, but I'm going to try to paraphrase some of what you were getting to. And basically what you started driving at, because you started getting pushback on Twitter and you started responding to it. A lot of the same tropes we hear about the southern border is like, oh, well, Venezuelans, they're just sending us, they're emptying their prisons and sending us all their bad folks. And then you went, and this one really hit me because I think you're right. I think this is going to happen. I'm going to quote you here, and this is the Google Translate. So if it's a little off, you tell me. But it said, in 2 years, you're going to see Republicans. And again, they've always said these are communist refugees. We need to help these people. What's going on in Venezuela? Correctly, what's going on in Venezuela is a humanitarian tragedy. This was one of the richest nations in the world through natural resources and other ways, and they completely wrecked the economy in basically 1 decade. You said several Republicans, you're going to start seeing them say, well, Venezuela isn't really that bad, that it's been fixed. Why not just make them all go back? I'm afraid you're right, but I'm afraid you're right because we're starting to hear that about Cuba. We've started to hear that about other places that legal immigrants even come to. There's this real hardcore wing, and it's always been there. You can go back to the 1880s and see the exact same propaganda of, well, you're native born or you need to go back. That kind of garbage. I think you're right because we've seen this over and over again all throughout American history where you have this and again, I'm not talking about illegal immigration, which is a problem that needs to be dealt with. Legal immigration, asylum seekers, refugees that we probably should be doing some kind of accommodation for. I think you're right to say that. What are you watching for in the next, like we said, they're going to keep doing these events. What are you watching for in the next few years that are going to be warning signs that the tide like that is turning?
Well, I think one of the most important things to note will be the way and the narrative that turns that Republican and conservative media outlets use to describe the Venezuelan situation, right? Until now, until a couple of months, it was always Venezuela was used as a talking point for campaign speech saying, this is what socialism does. It's really bad. People are fleeing for their lives or escaping a communist regime, which is all true. But if that tone, when they talk about Venezuela, changes from this is an example of what socialism can do to, oh, look, this is another example of what Biden failed immigration policy has done. And they're bringing criminals and all that. This Breitbart report that came out talking about that, which I think is really inconsistent and flimsy. If this is the new talking point when they talk about Venezuela, just the migratory issue, and completely forget the root cause of the problem, which is communism, socialism. If that's going on, then I'm afraid the Republican talking points and the Republican rhetoric on Venezuela will change drastically, and will go on, and they will just simply lump it in as if it was another immigration problem of, like, I don't know, Mexico and El Salvador or Guatemala or whatever.
Yeah, and this is a problem whether it's immigration, education, spending, whatever. When you start lumping things into buzzwords, you don't get any kind of good policy out of that because these things are complicated and you got to turn the noise down. That's why I have people like you on, my friend Daniel Chang Contreras, joining us. Till we get you back, I'm going to have you back because we're going to keep talking about this. This is going to continue to be an issue, unfortunately, for the Venezuelan people. Let folks know where they can follow you, what you got going on. We got your social media up on the screen. Let folks know what you got going on until they see you on Heard Tell again, my friend.
Yeah, you guys can follow me on Twitter. I usually post my thoughts over there, both in Spanish and English, and also write for El American, which is a conservative media outlet aimed at Hispanics. I occasionally write there, so anything that I post, I'll post it over there.
Great job, buddy. Good information. Love talking. Good time. We'll do it again real soon, sir. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, excited to have her back. If you missed her the first time she was on Heard Tell, stop what you're doing, pause this, go listen to that, and then come back because she is fantastic. Thrilled to have her back. Finesse Moreno-Rivera, accomplished criminologist. She's a Young Voices contributor. She is really, really good on this stuff, getting past the buzzwords, getting to data on things like justice, on things like criminality, on things like social justice. I'm so thrilled to have you back. Thanks for the time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's great to be back.
All right, we're going to talk about a hard one today. We're going to talk death penalty. Can we just start with some honesty before we get into stats and figures and the emotions of all this? Let's just start with some honesty. Here's where I'm at on the death penalty. I've been trying for years to talk myself into complete abolishment of the death penalty and never wanting to have it for any reason. But every now and then you just get that person that beat their kid to death with a ball bat, or, multiple serial killers with no remorse, or you got war criminal. There's always that exception that pops up and stops me just short of that. Now that war's against, I understand the flaws in our justice system. I understand the limitations of our government-run justice system. I understand they've got a whole lot of things they're not doing right, so I don't trust the process either. So that's where I'm at on it. You've got polling data. The polling numbers on death penalty are kind of coming down. Am I in the mainstream? Am I an outlier? Is there other people that feel like me, or am I just a weirdo by myself here with that kind of an honest assessment of it?
Absolutely not, Andrew. And thank you very much for your honesty. What the polls are showing, and me personally, I think that a lot of us feel the same way. What we're seeing is a strong 6 out of 10 adults who favor the death penalty. However, there's a huge caveat here in that they do believe that it's not applied racially neutral, that it does not deter crime, and that it's also a huge talking point for everyone, in that they're thinking about it should be applied to the most heinous crimes, the most severe that you're thinking of when you're thinking of killers or anyone of that nature. But as we all know, that's not how it's currently being applied at this time.
Yeah, and even the way it's written into our laws, there's still a federal death penalty. Some states have abolished it, like California. Some states have not, like Texas, which has put in an express lane. Everybody's dealing with it a little different. But even the way the law, for example, sexual assaults and rapes are not qualified for the death penalty, even though those are some of the most heinous crimes we have. Things like that, like even if you're pro-death penalty, just the nuts and bolts of the law, the black and white of the law and the legislation to it, there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of holes. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't been updated in decades, if not longer. Just the machinations of government on how we manage our criminal justice system. Is neglect a good word here, where it's just kind of been left alone and we do all the debating, but it hasn't been maintained, upkept, and paid attention to in the proper ways? Is that fair to say too here?
I think so. I really do. And it's definitely one of those hot topics where, again, it can be very heated. But it's one of those things where, we should definitely have a death penalty, but wait, I don't want to be the one who does it. I don't want to be the person who stands up and says yes or no. It's really interesting too when you said neglect, because for some states who even still have a death penalty, they haven't even, executed anyone in over decades. Oregon, Pennsylvania, these types of states. So they still have the law on the books, somewhat as a just in case, but they're actually just not even using it.
Yeah, and you're writing in the Counterpunch. I say this every time somebody's on, but you really need to read this piece. It's got a ton. I think I counted 38 links in this thing. There's a ton of links, a ton of information. You need to read the whole thing, decide for yourself. We've linked to it. Make sure you go through the piece because it's way more than we're going to get to today. But when you just start stacking the data up on this stuff, and you go all the way back to the colonies of the Americans and start talking about the death penalty, when you just start going through the data over and over and over again, break it down. What's a theme that you see when you see those big data sets? Because the numbers, your eyes just start moving. Did you see a theme that's consistent when you're looking at the data of the death penalty in America for the last 260 odd years?
There's quite a few themes. One can definitely say that there's a political theme. We all know the death penalty is utilized and also reinforced and brought back up depending upon our administration. Perfect example would be Trump was continuing the executions when he was in office, compared to Biden, who's really slow rolling through the process as of right now, if not halting all of them. There's actually still a racial theme. There's a theme of negligence. There is a lot that's going on where it's applied unfairly. It's completely unstandardized. I mean, when you really are looking at the data and everything stacking up, it's a bit shocking that it just seems reckless how we are applying this, and then also how we are carrying out the executions themselves.
Yeah. Finesse Moreno-Rivera joining us. Let's talk about the way we carry executions out, because this is something I don't hear people talk about very often. Look, I'm a history guy. I study history. There's been a lot of different ways to kill people when you need to kill somebody. All right. There's it's like the movie Million Ways to Die in the West. You can execute people a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. One of the things in America is we have used lethal injection pretty much exclusively, with a few very rare exceptions, for quite some time now. So we got a long data set on this. One of the inherent problems is, though, in our quest to have the most humane execution possible, we also picked one of the most complicated methods of execution possible. Like, it's not a simple process to do lethal injection because people, oh, they just put a needle in. No, that's not how that works. Talk about that, because at the core of when we start talking about government incompetence, or we're going to talk about the FDA part of it and the medical part of it, or we're going to talk about the morality part of it, making a more complicated way to executing people, that made a whole bunch of problems in itself. And then that just starts to really stress test all the other fractures that's in this process to begin with.
Absolutely. So, as listeners may or may not know, is the reason why we do have a death penalty and why it may not be looked at as a violation of our Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment is because our Congress looks to us, the American sample of people who are on juries, to say what our society, sees as being cruel and unusual. And to us, because we continue to lean towards the death penalty, that's why we still have it. With that being said, we're also looking at the idea of our society evolving in how we operate within executions, and just being the decency is actually the nomenclature that is utilized within the Constitution. So with that being said, you're looking and trying to execute someone in the most humane way. And so as you can see throughout history, we have tried various different techniques such as firing squad or gas asphyxiation or hangings. And that's where we landed with lethal injection, because it's what you just said, Andrew. You would think, okay, you just put a needle in and everything is done. However, there wasn't a lot of consideration as to how we would be able to keep up with the need for the chemicals utilized for the executions, or who would be administrating them. You think about needles, you're automatically going to think about a doctor, right? Well, you have to consider that doctors have ethical concerns because they're here to help us, to actually give us life, not take it away. So what you see is that there are some doctors who are involved in executions, but they're not, yelling it from the rooftop or, talking about this with their colleagues. That may just be their moral and value, thinking, okay, well, if anyone should be doing it, it should be me. But what we're seeing a lot of is with a lot of these stories are that those who are participating in these executions are, there's plenty of autopsy reports that come out that, they're seeing multiple holes, they're missing veins. It's taking a very long time for individuals to pass because of the products that they're using aren't what they are supposed to be. I don't want to get too far ahead here, but the main problem with lethal injection is that we actually don't have the correct medicines to use, the correct combinations in order to humanely execute someone. And in the beginning, Oklahoma, who is really out there right now in the news with a lot of their box executions, they were actually the very first individuals, or they had, a doctor who had come up with the three ingredients for performing executions. In the very beginning, the whole thought was that it would feel as though the inmate is falling asleep, so their heart is actually stopping. However, what we now know is that the three ingredients actually build up fluid within the lungs, so it makes the inmate feel as though they're drowning instead of actually just falling into a deep sleep and their heart stopping. So we also know the FDA can't regulate these substances, but I'll get to that as well. But, just really quickly, because lethal injection is fraught with a lot of issues when trying to come up with these chemicals, just a few days ago, it was announced that Alabama was going to try to pursue utilizing the nitrogen asphyxia, which also was brought up by Oklahoma legislator there, based on a paper from a criminal justice professor who isn't a scientist, who isn't a medical profession, looking at nitrogen. As we know, we need oxygen to breathe. So if you replace that with nitrogen, then you're going to start to feel, it'll work as though it's gas asphyxiation, pretty much. But the paper is only based on the effects that pilots or scuba divers have experienced whenever oxygen has been taken away and they're just naturally breathing in nitrogen. So yet again, what we're seeing is, just a play on people's lives, just trying to figure out what we can do to humanly execute these individuals, when really it's just we're just testing it as we go.
Finesse Moreno-Rivera. I don't want to be macabre about it, and I don't want to be flippant about it, but let me just say it for the sake of the conversation, because this is a grown folk adult conversation about this topic. It's a tough topic. When you really get down to it, there is no humane way to kill another human being. You got to kill them. Like you have to stop them from living, whether it's in combat or whatever else. If you're going to kill somebody, you got to do it, and you got to follow it all the way through. And the problem is human anatomy and human physiology and medical science, that's going to be a little bit different for every single human person, because they chemically react to things differently. And people are tougher than some other people. And there's some medical science stuff that we just can't explain scientifically. We just can't. That part of it is where the morality of it comes in, is because you talked about the botched executions and how horrible they could be. You noted one in your piece that went over 3 hours trying to get it done. The fact of the matter is, though, how do we reconcile those two things? Because it's like, look, whether it takes 90 seconds or 90 minutes, you're still killing a human being. The morality of that is something that we can't quantify in all that data set you have. So how do we deal with that part of it?
I think that's really interesting, because when it comes down to it, and I was really thinking about this and how to frame my thoughts, or even try to consider what others may be thinking when listening to this, or what others have thought, right? Like, again, this is a very hot topic. I think that this comes down to your values and your morals. And we know that shouldn't be a part of our criminal justice system, that truly should be apart from just looking at facts. But what it comes down to is that's what it is. We're actually saying it's okay to kill someone. And I think that a lot of people have a hard time accepting that and talking about that, because then you come into the conversation of thinking about, well, does that make me better than the person that we are executing? And at the end of the day, does it? I don't know. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Also, going back to what we're looking at, who are we executing? What have they done? Everyone's morals and values are different. And we also don't want to talk about, number one, the political lean, how these individuals are pawns. But then also, we don't talk about the religious aspect of it as well. Religion really does underscore a lot of our laws and a lot of our criminal justice system, whether we like it or not. We try to say that they're separate, but they're not. So, I think it comes down to morality and values to say that, yes, I'm okay with killing someone. And that may mean that you're not better than the person that we're executing.
Yeah. Finesse Moreno-Rivera, is the heart of the problem of this debate, though, is it's one thing to say on Twitter or Facebook or even in a courtroom, because you just mentioned the judge still says it, God have mercy on your soul when you give the death sentence. It's still in there. Isn't the core of this problem is it's one thing to say it. It's one thing to say it in the courtroom, but then some human being has to go and do that. And I really wonder when we discuss this, and I do it all the time, like somebody does something is like, yep, put them under the jail. That's a horrendous crime. And we all have that natural reaction. I wonder if it would change how we view this debate if we just skip ahead to the parts like, okay, this person has done something so bad that they need to be removed from society for the good of society. Are you willing to do the deed to get that done? Because I think that changes the whole perception on the whole thing right there.
Absolutely. So there's two things that I like to comment about that. Number one is, whenever I was referencing the poll earlier, that was from Pew Research Center. And, I'm really happy that they did include this as a caveat, that depending upon if this is an online poll or this is a phone call, that really skews how people answer and how they feel, right? I mean, that's a given. If you're talking to someone on the phone, you're definitely going to want to skew a different way compared to having that autonomy behind your computer, right behind your screen. Another thing as well is, I don't know if you follow a lot of YouTube channels, but there's one called Soft White Underbelly. Andrew, have you heard of that before?
I have one, but I've not seen the YouTube channel. No.
Okay, so soft white, soft white underbelly is made from. I want to say his name is Mark Leda, and what he does is he primarily operates out of California. And talks to individuals on Skid Row. He talks to people who are drug addicts. He'll talk to Johns. He'll talk to pimps plus with their prostitutes. He'll talk to prostitutes. He'll talk to gang members. He'll talk to people who have been shot. He'll talk to kids who are homeless. He does follow up on individuals. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And what's great about this channel compared to something like Intervention on A&E, which I think is completely exploitive and you really don't learn anything, is that it really shows you empathy. It shows you as, you know, as a person watching, you know, society and who an individual is. It's almost humanizing. So just yesterday, I pulled up his channel and he had an interview with a warden / executioner. And I mean, this guy was from Alabama, very straightforward guy, seems, you know, no whistles and bells. And, you know, when Mark said, what does it feel like to have to execute someone? And he said, you know, I don't lose any sleep about it. It's my job. And when the clock strikes 12, I hit that button and it's done. Because what they had was an electric chair. But the one thing that stuck with me is that he said that I treated them as a human being up to that single point. Me and my guards, that's what we did. And he said the number one thing, and the reason why he could sleep at night is because that he knew that that person, without a doubt, was responsible and that needed to be sentenced to death. And he said 9 times out of 10, these individuals would confess right up to the point they're walking to the chair. And I think that also is a great segue as well. We're talking about the Innocence Project, but that's a whole nother topic. But again, check that out, Soft White Underbelly. You could tell too, it wasn't something that he looked forward to, but it was something that needed to be done at the end of the day. But that was his job, right? We're not talking about people who just sign up, who just want to experience it, which I think is completely unethical. But that's also another story.
Finesse Moreno-Rivera, we're talking about the morality of it. It brings us back to what you dovetailed your piece in at the Counterpunch. Again, you need to read this whole thing because she has just stats galore and links all over this thing. It's well researched, like her stuff always is. That's why we're happy to have her on. We're talking about the morality of this. The fact of the matter is, part of the morality of being able to execute someone is, well, we followed the letter of the law. You know, you make the law the bad guy. Okay, the court, you know, a jury of his peers and the court and the legal system and all the appeals, we should have our hands clean in this execution because the entire justice system says this needs to happen. We can't say that with a straight face right now because the way the drugs are set up, the way the process is set up, the way the laws are set up, and you detail it in your piece to great detail. Pretty much every execution right now is in some shape or fashion going outside of the written letter of the law to get done. And that's just the fact it is right now. So if I'm going to be morally consistent, even if I understand that we should have a death penalty in some ways, you can't do the right thing the wrong way. So just the morality of it not being done correctly brings us right back to this moral imperative of we have to fix this system or we need to not do it until we get it fixed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because as of right now, we are operating outside of the law just to get these executions done. I mean, you know, with the state's regulations and even the federal regulations are just shrouded in secrecy. We don't know what's being done. We don't know where they're getting these chemicals from because they've been outlawed by the government to be imported from other countries. So, at this point, we're operating illegally to keep these executions going. And by going, Oklahoma's on pace to execute 2 people, I think, a month at this point.
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played.
And they have continuously been in the media for botched executions as well.
Yeah, Finesse Moreno-Rivera joining us. There are 26 states that have secrecy protocols surrounding how executions are done and the people that are involved. This is where we get from the morality. We can get into some regulation here because this is a government operation. It's a law enforcement function. I understand there needs to be protections of the executioner. The old trope about the executioner having the hood over his head, right? Like, okay, the executioner needs some protection, and they need some privacy, and they need some anonymity. I don't know that needs to extend to every single person involved, though, because it sure seems to me when we're looking at these, how do you have accountability? How do you make sure training standards are up to snuff? How do you make sure they're properly trained and know the procedures ahead of time? Because this is one of those things, look, you're only getting one shot at these things. Like, this isn't like something like, oh, we'll just do it again tomorrow if it doesn't work, right? You're there for the duration, and like you had this horrific botched execution that took 3 hours. Does these secrecy laws need to be looked at, or at least look at the procedures and go like, okay, 1 or 2 people need anonymity, but the rest of y'all, we need to have some accountability here?
Absolutely. To me, there should only be at the most 2 people within the room. There shouldn't be more than that. And everyone should have a reason as to why they are, whether that's the warden and then a doctor, preferably a doctor, but then that's it. There should be some type of accountability, because then to me, you're also just shrouding in secrecy your own morals and your own value. You're just hiding behind something because you maybe you're just scared to admit it to yourself. Maybe you're scared just to admit it to, the people who you work with, your family, your friends, society as a whole. There's no reason why these regulations should not be transparent. And the fact that they're not just, again, goes to show that something just isn't right.
Yeah. Finesse Moreno-Rivera joining us. You talk about the 8th Amendment. It has pretty vague language in this regard. That's not unusual in the Constitution. It has a lot of vague language in it because the idea was, well, this is the overarching thing, and then you states go figure it out and make legislation for it. So in and of itself, that's not an evil, but there is room for legislative fixes here. We're not going to change the 8th Amendment. That's not going to happen. What legislative fixes should be worked towards here? Even a state that wants to have the death penalty, what should be some of the things they're working for? Should it be the FDA gap where the FDA is no longer regulating the drugs? Should it be the medical staff that's involved that actually physically does these, like some kind of a specific training for them, since most doctors won't do it? Do you whatever that may be? Is it a law enforcement fix on the system that gets them there? What's some of the legislative things? Because that's an attainable goal that we should be working towards.
Oh, goodness, there's so many. So if we were to start at the very beginning, let's just look at how states' judicial systems are set up. So a perfect example, Andrew, you mentioned earlier Texas, because they are way ahead of any other state. I believe it's Texas for, and then Virginia for the most executions. The reason why Texas, for multiple reasons besides racial disparities, has such a high number of executions is predominantly based upon how its judicial system is set up. So number one being they have elected officials, and those elected officials are going to really be the voice box for, the population, which for Texas, they have a lot of proponents for death penalty. Number two would be that they don't have a public defense system set up. So whenever someone who can't afford an attorney has a capital case and they're sentenced to death, they are using a court-appointed attorney who may not have or may not be as seasoned with, capital offense cases, such as working with someone who's been on the, about to go on the death penalty, they're overworked, list goes on. But, another interesting thing too, is it wasn't until the 90s that Texas allowed for jurors to consider mitigating evidence. Mitigating evidence, as we all know, is a huge factor, because that's, including things such as your mental health or anything from your youth. I know that the Florida shooter, there's a case going on right now, or excuse me, a trial. And a lot of proponents who are, opponents against the death penalty are saying, look at his background, look at his youth. His mother drank a lot. He has a lot of mental health issues. So definitely, number one, you look at the state and how its judicial system is set up. So Texas is a perfect example. Number two, just getting the FDA involved. And I know that goes really against their oath of protecting the United States sentences. But at the same time, someone needs to be regulating these drugs that are being utilized. Number three, bring in scientists, bring in doctors. There should be scientists who are coming up with these quote unquote cocktails that are being utilized to execute individuals. There haven't been. They are literally just these individuals who work for these prisons and just come up with and say, oh, I think X, Y, and Z would work because this will stop the heart, this will stop the breathing. And we know that there's no science that's backing all of this, but these combination of drugs. And like you mentioned earlier, not one thing is going to work for everyone. Everyone's different. Also making sure that, we're keeping out, foreign imports, making sure that we're making, having a really tight hold on regulations about what's being used. So there's so many things that need to be done. And also standardizing protocols. There is no standardized protocol, which to me is just insane, thinking about we're actually executing someone and there's no protocol for it. Everything's different. Whatever, it's kind of like whatever they say goes. And there's just so much that needs to be done policy-wise that it's almost like, where do you start?
Well, our friends that are against the death penalty in total will look at you and throw their hands up and say some very unnice words and go, well, that's why you ban it. That's going to be their answer to that question.
Right.
Is there a refutation to that other than the 30 minutes we just spent talking about it?
I would like to see it banned, but at the same time, it goes back to that moral values. It goes back to religion. It goes back to politics. And it also goes back to, I sincerely can say that I have never lost anyone close to me and been in the position of knowing that and it's like the perpetrator is sentenced to death. I can't sit here and say that my mind wouldn't change if it wasn't my mother, my father, or a family member. I don't know, but at this time, what I feel is that if we're going to do it, then we better be following the letter of the law. We better be doing it the way that we should be doing it. Because if we're not, then what's the point? Then we're just killing someone.
Yeah. Finesse, Moreno-Rivera, you do all this research on an analysis on the justice system. We have to bring this up because I think it's only fair to discuss this. There is a large strain of thought when it comes to the death penalty that even the people that do some of the more heinous crimes, heinous, that's not a word, even some of the folks that do the most heinous crimes, people will say, look, most of those people, it wasn't their first offense. It was multiple offenses. The system creates them. And now we're going to use the system to kill what the system created. I don't go quite that far with it, although I'm empathetic to some of that in certain circumstances. I don't think you can broad brush it that far. But that's something a lot of people feel, especially people who are basically, career institutionalized criminals who spend most of these folks on death row spend most of their lives in prison because of how long it takes. What about that argument? Because you've done the data on this, those people, I think the average in death row is, decades. What do you say to that? Of like, look, we're creating criminals to kill something we ourselves created. That's immoral in and of itself. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but I understand the argument.
I understand the argument too, but I'm with you. You just can't make that broad stroke. You just can't. You honestly can't. I mean, we definitely create it. We are a society who we punish rather than empower and help and intervene. But at the same time, I don't think that I can completely agree with that.
Is talking about the death penalty as punishment one of those things that's a linguistic thing we should stop doing? Because it's not really a punishment, it's an intervention. You know, you're not punishing them, you're killing them. That's the end. That's a period. That's there's nothing after that. Should we be changing the language, how we discuss these sorts of things? Is it a nomenclature problem on top of everything else where we're still talking about it like it's the Wild West and we're hanging people, when this is really almost, I hate to say sanitized because you're still taking somebody's life, but it's years of courtroom and it's years, it's such a long process now. Do we need to just change how we talk about it altogether?
Absolutely. I think that we all need to just sit down and be honest with each other and, you know, say what it is. You are taking someone's life. You are killing someone at the end of the day. This is what we're doing. I mean, it's a long process. I mean, that takes a lot of money. And, you know, on top of that, we're not even really sanitizing anything. You know, we still have rampant crime. We're still, you know, sending people to the chair. That's what, you know, that's an old nomenclature, right? It's not an intervention. It's not sanitizing anything. We still have criminals, you know, every single day doing horrible things, and it's not deterring them. I mean, there's plenty of research that's out there that's saying it's not a deterrence. We are literally just killing someone just to say an eye for an eye. That's what this is.
Yeah. This is one of the harder topics to discuss because it's life and death, and it's life and death with government sanctioning, which is really hard to get into the morality of it. But Finesse Moreno-Rivera, I so enjoy having you on. We're going to do a long form on this because there's a whole piece to this on the medical side that we just kind of brushed by, but we really need to get into because there's a lot of ethics and things that go into that, and there's a lot of government regulation that needs to be fixed in that. So we're going to have you back. We're going to do a long form on this topic because there's so much to do on this. And I want to read up on a few things before I get into it because you're a lot smarter than I am. So I want to do some research and be boned up for it. But we're definitely having you back. Can you let folks know where they can follow you and keep up with what you're doing between now and they get to see you again on Heard Tell until we get you back, my friend?
Of course. Thank you, Andrew. Recently, I created a Twitter account so I can be found at Finesse Moreno. And then also I can always be followed on my LinkedIn where I continuously upload any articles that I have completed through Young Voices.
Fantastic. And I'm going to get you on Twitter Supper Club. We got to get you involved on that because that's one of the great things on Twitter is us doing our food stuff all the time. So maybe you can start Twitter Orchid Club or something. You can do that with all your lovely orchids back there, which is why we really have you on the show so we can look at your orchids. We kid. You do great work. We greatly appreciate you. She's also a Young Voices contributor. You can see all her stuff on her page. Let's do a lighter topic next time because I always enjoy talking to you. But you do criminality. This is what you do.
I know. You know, it's so funny. My fiance recently said, you know, why can't you just write about something happy and good? So I think I'll be doing something on prison reform here soon. So hopefully next time you have me on, I'll be talking about some good things that have been happening within the criminal justice realm.
We all need some good news too, so that'll be great. Finesse Moreno-Rivera, you are fantastic, madam. Thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Welcome back to Herd. Okay, been a minute since we had him on, but he is a good friend of ours. We love talking to him. He's at the Dispatch. He's an associate editor there. You've seen him write in a lot of other places as well. Good guy. Andrew Egger, how are you, sir? Good to see you again.
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you today?
Good to be with you. Let's go way out west, even though we're both on the East Coast. A lot of interesting stuff going on in Arizona. I want to start with it on this, and we're going to be working off your piece in the Dispatch. We will be linking to this. Read the whole thing for yourself, like we always says. The Mark Kelly, Blake Masters Arizona race has gotten really interesting for a lot of the wrong reasons. I want to start here, though, because you cover this stuff. You report on it. Somebody told me a long time ago when I started doing media, they're like, look, when it comes to political races, the writers always want to talk about the horse race. The experts always watch the money. You're watching the money in this race. You're seeing a trend in the money, and the money's coming back to a lot of the power struggle going on in D.C. right now.
Yeah, well, the money has been, as far as this particular race is concerned, maybe the most interesting story in recent weeks on the Republican side, because what we've seen is a little bit of a standoff, a little bit of a game of chicken between Mitch McConnell, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who basically his job at this point in the midterms is just getting as many Republican Senate candidates over the finish line as he possibly can, to whatever extent he has the ability to influence that with his own PAC money. And a relative newcomer to these sorts of funding games, who is billionaire Peter Thiel, who jumped in a major way in the Republican primaries in a couple of states to elevate candidates who he knew personally and who represented a kind of sort of disruptive brand of Republican politics that he endorsed. And those two candidates were in Ohio, J.D. Vance, and in Arizona, Blake Masters, both just sort of former mentees of Peter Thiel's personally. In Ohio, Vance is not doing as well as you might expect the median Republican to do, but he's still favored to win. It's a very red state. In Arizona, Blake Masters has been lagging behind what you might expect kind of the median Republican to do in a relatively favorable year for Republicans nationwide in what's, an extremely purple state. Joe Biden won it by a hair in 2020. Essentially, you've got Carrie Lake in the governor's race running a couple points ahead of her competitor, even though she is like as MAGA as they come. She's not, exactly a big tent person who's drawing from like every possible Republican voter, but she's still running ahead. Blake Masters, by contrast, running against Democratic Senator Mark Kelly, is running about 8 points behind, maybe between 5 and 8 points behind, depending on the poll. And so with Democrats wildly outspending Republicans basically across the board right now, Mitch McConnell has been leaning on Peter Thiel, who put up a ton of money for Masters in the primary, basically saying, look, you put $15 million up for this guy and you got him through the Republican primary, probably over candidates that I would have thought would have been stronger in the general, that I would have rather seen. The least you can do is just keep that money spigot turned on for now. Let me spend my kind of limited quantity of dollars on some of these other races around the country, such as in Ohio, such as in New Hampshire, Nevada, and just take this one off my plate. Thiel, at least in kind of public reporting, he hasn't said anything publicly, but you get kind of the sources close to Thiel say, in the Washington Post or whatever, basically sees his own mission as not being to help Mitch McConnell retake the Senate. He's like, look, I got my guy through the Republican primaries. I feel like my job's done, and he doesn't want to kick in a bunch more money. So what you've seen is this standoff, and it really came to a head last week because McConnell finally basically just said, okay, look, like maybe you're going to spend, maybe you're not going to spend, but I feel like my dollars can be better used elsewhere. And he pulled his super PAC, the Senate Leadership Fund, pulled all of its spending out of Arizona, which they had initially allotted about $16 million for outside spending there in this race. They had previously cut that by about half at the end of August, and then last week basically said, it's all gone. You're on your own. If other outside groups want to come in, they're welcome to do that. And basically said, Peter Thiel, if you want to come in and try to rescue your guy, you can do that. But we're taking our business elsewhere.
Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a sequence. Andrew Egger from the Dispatch joining us. The reason McConnell's involved at all is because he's fighting on another front with Rick Scott, who's actually got the job of getting people elected to the Senate as his job as chairmanship. He's been fighting with Rick Scott. He's stepping in because of a lack of funding coming from there. That's part of the story too, because you got Mitch getting kind of tugged in both. From Mitch's point of view, he's going to be like, usually this wouldn't be my job to do this, but I'm stepping in and doing it. That's going on at the same time in parallel to the story.
Right. There's and you always see, I mean, there's always a bunch of different groups that kind of ideally work hand in glove with one another, if not with the campaigns. It's illegal for them to work hand in glove with the campaigns, but just kind of fellow travelers on the road toward getting as many Republicans elected as possible. And the primary arm of that, as you say, usually the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which is chaired by Senator Rick Scott of Florida right now. They, as just a matter of dollars and cents, have not been unbelievably productive in the fundraising, in getting out the money to Republican candidates. That's kind of one leg missing of the stool, and a second leg missing of the stool for a lot of Republican Senate candidates right now is that Donald Trump, despite not being on the ballot and not being in office, continues to hoover up a remarkable amount of the small dollar Republican donations that are available around the country. He's got about $100 million he's currently sitting on in the bank as per his most recent FEC reports. And he has done a little bit, but not that much, by way of, tossing a little bit here, a little bit there to candidates. So basically, with kind of the small dollar stuff mostly going to Trump and the NRSC largely missing in action, you always have these kind of leadership PACs that get involved and things like that. But it's definitely McConnell's PAC has had to sort of take on an outsized role in this particular cycle for those reasons.
Yeah, Andrew Egger joining us. The other part of this story that involves money is Masters' opponent, Mark Kelly. And something that for some reason isn't getting covered in this story, but all the insiders I talked to and all the reporters, this is the first thing they mention. Kelly has been an absolute money printer. He's one of the biggest fundraisers for Democrats across the board, not just in the Senate. He's the biggest fundraiser they got, and it's not particularly close. He's got something like $24 million on hand. That's also part of this because it really threw it into sharp relief of, holy cow, this guy, look, he's an astronaut. He's managed to moderate, although he's, fairly mainline progressive in his voting record. He projects pretty moderately. He's not a big social media guy. He's not a big in front of the microphone guy. I think he's running a smart campaign. He's got a ton of money. And you know this because you're a reporter, where money really does matter is ad buys when you have opposition research against your opponent in a major market. Hello, Phoenix. And Masters has a lot of oppo research. That money difference is the other part of this folks need to pay attention to, isn't it? Because it's massive.
Right. Yeah. And when you're talking kind of internal versus external money, when you're talking the money the campaigns themselves have versus, kind of the air support that can get dropped in nationally, all this stuff we've been talking about is that national external support. But it is by far the biggest gap in any close Senate race this year. I mean, there's always incumbents always come in with a pretty remarkable, almost always come in with a pretty remarkable cash advantage over their non-incumbent challengers. But this one is special. During the summer reporting FEC cycle, as you mentioned, Masters had something, Kelly had something like $25 million in cash on hand. Blake Masters has had something like 1.6 million. I mean, it was truly, like 12 to 1, basically. And that has not significantly changed. I've heard from sources close to Blake Masters' campaign that they are having their best fundraising quarter so far, which you would certainly hope so. But just as far as the actual kind of spend on the ground, they're not booking ads. I mean, Blake Masters doesn't currently have TV ad buys slated between now and the midterms for his campaign period, which is just remarkable for a top level swing seat Senate race. He's basically he's relied almost entirely on outside spending to get him this far, which formerly was coming almost entirely from Peter Thiel. And now Thiel is out and McConnell is out, and he's having to basically piece together, the only things that are getting spent in the state on his behalf are coming from, say, like $5 million here from the PAC arm of Heritage Action for America, the the campaign's arm of the Heritage Foundation. Little money coming in from the PAC that was Teal's PAC before, although it's not Teal's money. A little bit coming in from the Susan B. Anthony pro-life groups, but it's all basically, it's chump change compared to what McConnell had slated before. And you really do see. I don't know if the rats fleeing a sinking ship is the right analogy exactly, but it is kind of an astonishing spending gap, especially when you consider that Kelly is also already polling a number of points up.
Yeah, Andrew Egger joining us. And the other part of this, you just mentioned it. I have my own caveat on that. When I'm watching politics, one of the things I really pay attention to is when the blame game starts before you actually have a result. That's usually a telltale sign. I think a lot of this McConnell Thiel stuff and the master stuff and the MAGA stuff, and we're going to talk about Trump in a minute, that part of it too. I think a lot of this is actually the blame game setting up, because part of the looming shadow of this race is Arizona is rapidly changing. It's going purple. It's a diversifying state. The demographics are changing. And we're going to do this again basically in 2 years, which basically means in about a year, we're going to do this all over again, because they're going to primary Sinema. And that's going to be another hotly contested race. I think it's not only a blame game. I think we got a lot of positioning going on in Arizona for what's getting ready to happen when they think they might have an easy pickup, because they're going to primary Sinema. That's going to happen. And we're going to do this all over again in 6 months, a year, if not sooner.
Right. No, you're absolutely right about that. And I think that a big part of this is that Blake Masters going in was kind of a trial balloon candidate for a specific kind of political coalition, a coalition maybe that exists more online than anything else. I mean, he's supposed to be one of these guys who is quote unquote based,
I still don't know what that means. Maybe I'm uncool.
Basically,
can you explain it to me? Because everybody seemes to have a different definition. Like my kid's saying slay. Slay. I don't know what it means, but based.
In Masters' case, it essentially is just supposed to mean that he is more aligned with the kind of very online new right, somewhat like J.D. Vance, more willing to kind of use the levers of state power to accomplish right-wing ends, less committed to sort of setting up and establishing a sort of value-neutral liberal sphere of lawmaking, sort of as a backdrop for political struggles to play out against, a lot more skeptical of foreign intervention, a lot more skeptical of big tech, more and big tech probably as the primary avenue in which they're more comfortable using what more classical conservatives would see as kind of unacceptably strong arm tactics, interfering with markets to basically break the political power of companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter. So he's sort of seen as being at the vanguard of a lot of that stuff, even though obviously in a lot of times perception and reality don't necessarily line up. But because there's a big political coalition online that wants to see a lot more candidates like Masters, it is not a good thing for Masters just to kind of like go up in smoke under his own power, which to be fair, I mean, to be fair to that coalition, it's not like Masters has run a super tight race and worked super hard and is now coming up short. I mean, these things like the fundraising and some of the kind of policy headaches that he's caused for himself seem to have a lot more to do with just kind of like being a political rookie than they do with any particular, political coalition that he represents. He's just, I mean, he didn't seem to think he would need to raise his own money coming into the race and pound the pavement and do that. And now that's coming back to bite him. But obviously, since he is sort of a figurehead of this kind of movement, you've already seen a lot of these people, a lot of these kind of new right, more MAGA type guys setting up this move of McConnell to pull away as like the thing that maybe is going to have sunk the Masters campaign, which is, I mean, in my analytical point of view, extremely transparently just a cover. But what you've seen is probably the most prominent move of this kind. I mean, obviously, there have been a lot of op-eds kind of chastising Mitch McConnell from media aligned with these people. But the chair of the state Republican Party, who is Kelly Ward, who's a very, just kind of very, very MAGA type grassroots person. I mean, like she was all in on the election fraud stuff a couple of years ago, still is, that sort of thing. She sent an open letter to McConnell immediately prior to his pulling out the move, and I guess she sent it. The state party sent it. She's the chair. Basically just saying, look, this is a winnable race. We really need you to double down here. We really, really think that, the more you spend, the better off we are. And she didn't just send it to Mitch McConnell. It's an open letter, right? It's setting him up to kind of to be the fall guy if and when Masters loses. And you can see why they would rather it be McConnell, the kind of establishment guy who they could point the finger at, rather than saying, okay, was Blake Masters a bad candidate? Is this sort of campaign a non-starter in a swing state? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and for those of you that are uninitiated, go back a couple years. Kelly Ward does not like Mitch McConnell at all, and she's very public, and there's a lot of video on it if you want to look it up yourself. We're continuing our conversation with Andrew Egger of the Dispatch. Does great work. Okay, the looming thing in every single race on the Republican side is, what's Donald Trump doing? Well, he says a lot of stuff. He truth socials a lot of stuff because he can't tweet anymore. He releases statements about a lot of stuff. But what do we start with our conversation? Following the money usually tells us a lot about these campaigns. He's not spending a lot of money on these races, even ones like this where it looks like he's got a candidate of his choice in a spot to actually make a difference.
Right. So the big question here, and this is a development even since I wrote the piece we've been talking about, it is not necessarily such a slam dunk that Donald Trump isn't spending anymore. There was a piece of news over the weekend that his campaign is, or at least advisors close to him, again, not the campaign, have been setting up a new super PAC that in theory they could use to funnel a lot more money into these midterms. I mean, you can stand these things up pretty quickly. The campaign could put money into the PAC, and then the PAC could be used to help out guys like Masters. And you have actually, I mean, Mitch McConnell spoke approvingly about this. We don't yet know what that's going to look like, whether it's a flash in the pan, whether it's like real money, whether he's really going to like put a lot behind this to prop up guys like Masters. Masters is endorsed by Trump. A lot of these guys in these swing states won their primaries largely on the back of a Trump endorsement. So it would seem like it would make a lot of sense unless he makes the analytical assumption that Masters is so far underwater that he's better off trying to shore up his guys elsewhere. But in theory, this is the other reason why McConnell might have pulled out of the Masters race, not because he necessarily sees it as a lost cause, but just to really put the pressure on both Thiel and Trump to hopefully get more involved. So I think you'd certainly, Mitch McConnell would certainly breathe a sigh of relief to see any more money flowing into his guys' races, even down in places where he is no longer spending himself.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on that because Trump's got a lot of other expenses, i.e. legal expenses coming on that you can divver the numbers and get campaign cash to that in certain ways. I suspect that's probably what he's doing there.
That's basically, the legal stuff is basically the only thing he's been spending money on out of his $100 million in the bank for the past several months.
And to be fair, he's got good reason to want to hoard some money for legal things coming up from the look of things. Let's talk about these candidates for a second. You mentioned Peter Thiel's two candidates are Blake Masters and J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, and this isn't my opinion, this is sourced, has consistently refused to get any kind of outside help, whether it was conservative help, MAGA help, the libertarians, I know for a fact reached out. I talked to them about it. He's refused any outside help at all, and it shows. Now, Ohio's red enough. He may get away with it and slide through anyway. Herschel Walker down in Georgia started out kind of a disaster. About 6-7 weeks ago, he accepted outside help. They got some campaign folks in there. His numbers are coming back up. He's doing smart stuff now, like downplaying his poll. That's strategy stuff. He didn't just come out and say that. He got some help. It's not just the money. You actually have to run a campaign too. The money's one thing, but do you see Blake Masters getting any offers or any help from the outside whatsoever to try to turn this around at this late hour? Because if they're not going to give him money, if there's no money, there's none of those same consultants that are bailing out Herschel Walker and those folks going to come running because you ain't going to be paying them.
Right. Yeah, they have had some staff turnover, and I'm not incredibly well versed on the details of how it all went down. I mean, his campaign manager either quit or was fired a month ago or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's the basic problem that you identify. I mean, there are better places to go if you are like a crack operative than the Blake Masters campaign in Arizona. I mean, they're basically keeping the lights on, and that's it as far as their internal money is concerned. So yeah, it's a real problem. I have not heard anything about kind of a rescue team coming in for Blake Masters.
What do we make of McConnell here? Because he's getting towards the end. If they don't get the majority back, it's hard to see where maybe they probably won't get it the next cycle either. It's not even politics. Like the Senate runs more to the cycle than the House does because you got certain races in certain places, a third of the Senate every 2 years. You can kind of guess where it's going to go. This seems like a weird way for him to spend his last hurrah. Does he do this out of duty, do you think? Does he really think they got a chance of taking the Senate? What do you think his motivations here, or is there a little bit of pride involved here of like, no, wait a minute, I'm still in charge here, especially with the Rick Scott stuff going on behind his back. Like, no, I'm in charge. Let me flex a little bit here because I've got the money to do it.
Yeah, I've always felt like Mitch McConnell is one of the easiest guys to do kind of psychoanalysis on in all of politics. I mean, it's like he wakes up every morning trying to maximize Republicans' chances of retaking the body and making him majority leader again, right? So those odds have slimmed somewhat over the summer. It's not looking as good that he's going to get that back from Chuck Schumer as it did before. But it's just, you can usually just count on McConnell to make the high percentage play. So he has a certain amount of dollars to spend in his PAC to try to, find some path, some strategic path back to the majority. And he's just taking the play that maximizes that. And I think, as far as pride and things are concerned, I just think he's been willing to eat a lot of indignity all through the Trump era. He's usually willing to be the bad guy. He doesn't have a tendency to kind of blink in the face of these kind of pressure campaigns of like, well, look, if you don't sort of go along with this strategic line, you're going to look really bad in conservative media, which is also part of the reason why he's become such a conservative media villain a lot of the time. It's just kind of the proto-establishment guy. I see basically no reason to believe that there's anything other than strategic considerations going into a lot of these things. Some people have said, Blake Masters was kind of insulting to Mitch McConnell during the primary, and maybe that's why. I don't necessarily buy that. Masters had already significantly moderated his tone on McConnell after he won the primary. McConnell's hosted fundraisers for him in DC. So it does seem, in theory, that line is there. I think if Masters does lose, people will make a lot of that. But again, I think the easiest analytical line, and usually the most accurate one, is McConnell's trying to help Republicans retake the Senate by any means necessary.
Yeah, Andrew Egger of the Dispatch joining us. You mentioned it specifically in your piece. I kind of was setting that up for this because whatever you think of Cocaine Mitch, good, bad, or indifferent, he wants the Republicans to win, the party to win, raise all boats. If he's got to do a little dirty work to do that, he'll do that. If he has to do whatever, he wants the Senate. That's his sole goal. The reason that's clashing with people like Peter Thiel, with people like Donald Trump, with the MAGA wing of the party, is because they first and foremost want a specific kind of candidate to win. And then they think about majorities somewhat secondly. That's the conflict. And this is not going to be the last time the GOP deals with this. They're going to deal with this in 2024, whether it's Trump or somebody else. This is ingrained into the GOP dynamic right now, isn't it? This insider, outsider, the old guard that understands that you got to legislate, folks that want a specific kind of purity candidates. This isn't going away anytime soon, is it?
No, definitely. You're absolutely right. And I think that, McConnell is too good of a kind of heel for the MAGA people, for them to stop going after him. And there's really no downside to it, because at the end of the day, he doesn't really punch back. I mean, if Donald Trump becomes president again, Mitch McConnell is going to be his most valuable ally again. And that's just kind of full stop in terms of getting the things passed that he wants to get passed. So I think we are likely to continue to see this exact same kind of one dynamic in the actual in the actual power centers of Washington, and another dynamic completely playing out in Trump's statements and MAGA Twitter and conservative media, basically up until the point when either Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell, their meal ticket runs out and they step away.
Yeah, I'm not taking the over-under on which one of them gets out of politics first, because it's basically going to be one of them is going to have to pass away, I'm afraid. That's the only reason either one of those are going to give it up.
Well, McConnell doesn't have term limits, so that helps. But once more and done at best for Trump, right?
You'd think so, but look, they call Mitch the turtle for a reason, and it is a backhanded compliment. You use the term heel. That's a pro wrestling term for those of you that are uninitiated. He plays the bad guy on purpose to get the result he wants. He understands that he can take the flack. He's electorally secure. That's why he can tolerate things like Trump, because Trump really can't touch him, so he can play along. That's very much ingrained in who Mitch McConnell is. So yeah, Blake Masters can absolutely trash him in the primary and then turn around and ask him for help, and he's going to eat it and go do it because he thinks when they lose Mitch McConnell in the GOP and the Senate, I don't think the GOP and especially maybe the MAGA wing realize the lightning rod that they're losing. He's umbrellaed a lot of crap off of the GOP over the years. He's gotten a lot of stuff done. Whether you like him or not, he's effective. Like, it was shocking when Schumer got one over on him on Bill Back Mansion. That's how good he is that it surprised people, right? I don't think people realize when Mitch steps off the scene what a void that's going to leave in the GOP in Washington and how they actually get stuff done, is it?
Well, it's hard to imagine who the next one up would be. I mean, it's impossible for me to imagine Rick Scott. Well, the Johns more so than Scott, I think. I think, yeah. I mean, Cornyn could do it. Thune could do it. I have no idea what they'd look like, because I haven't talked to anybody close to any of the three of them about what that would look like. But yeah, I mean, I haven't covered other majority leaders than him and Schumer. He's been around a while, but I mean, I think you're exactly right with the lightning rod analogy. That's been the big, just taking the pressure off of individual members as far as like hard votes is concerned. Letting that is one of the biggest differences between Trump and McConnell as far as the actual act of legislation is concerned, is that McConnell, as long as he had the votes to pass something, was always more than happy to bless individual senators who needed to peel off for this or that or the other ideological reason. Whereas Trump, every vote that he cared about was a purity test, where he kind of dared all of everybody in both houses to cross him at their peril, and it was, just two very different styles, one of which is more conducive to having more Republicans in office in the long run than the other.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch. Andrew Egger of the Dispatch. Big doings at the Dispatch. You are moving over. You're going back to a website-based thing. You got some big names coming in lately. Let folks know what's going on over at the Dispatch, where you've been working, where I've been reading. It's a daily read for me. I'm subscribed to it. But let folks know, because y'all got some big doings going on over there.
Yeah, it's been fun. So the couple names we've hired recently: Kevin Williamson over from National Review, Ala Pundit, who we now have to refer to as Nick Catogio. I actually don't know how you pronounce his last name. It's hard not to just say Ala Pundit over from Hot Air. It's been concerning. They both came in and started writing a lot very quickly, and kind of, I think, put the pressure on everybody else to up our own output. But those have been great. Got to meet Kevin at a staff retreat we had a week or two ago. Have yet to actually meet Nick, aka Ala Pundit, but looking forward to that as well. And then we are officially in the next couple of months here saying farewell to Substack, where we have lived since we launched in 2019. They've been a useful platform for us to grow, but I think the consensus is that we have kind of outgrown them, and that they are they're basically just, it was our partnership with them was kind of a trial balloon to be like, could you run like a full company through this product, as opposed to what they had kind of initially set themselves up for, which is like individual writers with their newsletters. And I think that as we got larger, for a very small editorial company, maybe the answer is yes. for a small to medium sized one, increasingly no, just in terms of the amount of control we had over our own back end and things like that. But hopefully that part will not actually be a big deal to anybody, because we're trying to make it as kind of seamless, and it's not going to be a big splashy not a lot of new bells and whistles on the new site or anything like that. But hopefully it'll still be a good experience for people on the other side.
Yeah, and Ala Pundit, I'm not even going to try to call him Nick. It's just going to be too weird. He's one of the few writers, agree or disagree, and I didn't always agree with him. He's one of the few writers, like when something broke, I was like, I want to know what Ala Pundit thinks about it. He's that good. For folks that have never read him, left, right, or center, he's one of those I tell my progressive friends, like, you need to read this guy. Like, he's one of the guys, he's basically been a daily read for years for me. So I was very excited for you guys to get him.
Yeah, and if something breaks, I mean, odds are he has written about it. I mean, unbelievably prolific output, but like really thoughtful. I mean, it's not like he's just kind of firing off half-baked takes. It's always very the kind of like the intersection of high quality and high quantity. I don't know that I've seen anything like it before.
Yeah, and Williamson is the combustible element. He goes there. He has a unique writing style that you got to read it, whether you hate read it or love read it. You got to read it because of the way he writes. So we'll be watching with success. Andrew Eggers, always thrilled to have you. Let folks know where your social media is till we get you back on Heard Tell again. It will not be as long as last time, my friend, because we're going to have a very busy fall, I think.
All right. Yeah. Find me on Twitter, EggerDC. Find me at thedispatch.com, where I have my writing up pretty frequently, edit the morning newsletter. Come say hi.
Yep, fantastic stuff. Andrew Egger, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back over to the UK. Everybody's had their little break from our UK news for the last few weeks we've been going through. There's a lot going on over there. This is who's going to walk us all through it, explain it so well that even I will be able to understand it. He's a Young Voices contributor, real sharp guy. Looking forward to this. Benjamin Coates, how are you, sir? Thank you so much for the time.
Hello, Andrew. No worries. I'm well, thank you.
Live from London on this fine day. Let's start here, big picture, because of course all the eyes of the world were on England and the UK for the last 2-3 weeks now with the passing of the Queen. Politically, though, that became kind of the eye of the storm because things politically were going kind of really ugly. Everybody kind of got the pause because of the Queen's death. You have this great moment of national unity. Boy, howdy, has the storm come back and in a hurry, hadn't it?
Well, I think is it the Chinese proverb about interesting times, and they're interesting times here.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to talk some foreign policy with you because you've been writing about it, but let's start domestically because everybody's worried about that. The cost of living crisis. People are talking about taxes. People are talking about economic programs. People are talking about getting direct assistance to people for this looming winter. Let's just start that. You got a brand new prime minister who, how's that for your second day on the job and the Queen died? Yes. Get handed that one. So really, this has kind of been her first week at work for all intents and purposes. How's it going? Is it as rough on the ground as it's looking on the media and from afar?
Well, I mean, I suppose it is. Just only, I think, an hour ago, I think a poll came out with something like a 20 or 30 point Labour lead, which is only seen that in the mid-90s, just before Blair came in. But there are big caveats to that. We're not going to have an election tomorrow. And there does seem to have been an overreaction to the sort of so-called mini budget and all the rest. I don't want any of your listeners to switch off, so I won't talk too much about it. But there are so many problems in the world economically for a lot of countries. The very strong dollar, obviously all that's going on in Ukraine. And I think perhaps the pound and Britain has been singled out a little, and there've definitely been market jitters. But I think nothing is happening here that is unprecedented. We're lowering our top rate of tax to the rate it was during a Labour government. It's still more than many countries, including the US. And every nation really in our position, and Germany's just announced this, will be giving money for energy prices this winter. Nothing that strange was announced, and I think it is a bit of a storm in a teacup. That's not to say that there aren't recessions coming and difficult economic times, but that's not entirely down to the budget, far from it. And you'll see that Europe-wide at least.
Yeah. One of our founding principles in our program is things don't happen in a vacuum, they happen in a sequence. For the casual observer, though, because everybody focuses on the moment, they're like, well, the conservatives have been in power for 12 years, so it's more than that, because we understand economics is an up and down thing over decades, not over even years or quarters. There's repercussions. You've had a lot of economic things happen in the UK. You have demographic change, you have immigrant change, you have Brexit. Going back the last 10 or 15 years, especially, because everybody's talking about that 12 years of conservative rule, as they should, because, cyclically, it's going to catch up to you at some point. But economics don't go along with the politics. Go to the last 10 or 15 years that brought Britain to this moment. Yes, there's a crisis, but what the crisis is really doing is revealing the cracks in the issues that were already there, right?
That's absolutely right. And I think that in democracies, at least, you reap what the guy before you sowed. And we are now seeing the culmination in many regards of the mismanagement of our country for decades under both Blair in New Labour and also the Conservatives since 2010, where we haven't had a jot of economic growth since 2008. We didn't invest when it was cheap to borrow. We didn't build the nuclear power stations that we've needed to build. And we've had a historic shortage, which is completely voluntary, by the way. It's based on legislation and it wouldn't cost a penny to repeal, with regards to planning permission to build houses and also, businesses and scientific labs. So Liz Truss really has got into the chair at the wrong point. And I'm not saying that the budget was perfect or the messaging around it is perfect, but we are now a relatively poor country, which is a bitter pill to swallow. And it's one I think a lot of my countrymen refuse to. But the situation we're in really has been, as you say, a culmination of 10 or 20 years of actions. She came to the job a couple of days ago. No one, however bad, could screw up an economy in 2 or 3 days that didn't have very serious problems made by people previous.
Yeah, Ben Coach joining us from London. It's always going to be a little bit of both. The policies you actually enact and the policies you don't enact. Both of those have almost, an effect. Give me the ratio, because you have a parliamentary system. So especially in America, we look at it like, with very few legal exceptions and a little bit of judicial oversight, pretty much what Parliament says goes. So even more so than in the States, when it's a policy, either omission or commission, sin of policy, whether you did it or you didn't do a policy or the policy was bad, this is almost entirely on Parliament, yes?
Yes, fundamentally, yes. One of the troubles with our country is that I suppose business life and economic life more generally actually goes through loads of layers, local government, planning permission, things like that, where Parliament should have legislated. And Parliament has the power. Parliament has supreme power. The saying goes that Parliament could ban smoking on the streets of Paris, which is, as it were, an analogy to say that Parliament is supreme in our constitution. It can command anything. But our politicians in Westminster haven't commanded the things that would improve economic growth. So the trouble is that actually you've had local politics strangle housing, strangle scientific lab spacing, and so on, was really one of the big contributors to our economic crisis. If you're thinking about trying to locate cost of living problems in the UK, which obviously is a big theme, try the fact that the percentage of your income to either rent or mortgage is vastly higher than really any time in our country's history. So yes, it is a problem in Parliament. It's caused often by actions lower down. But yes, it is on Parliament that we're here.
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to the District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. Coach joining us. Let's talk prime ministers. You got the brand new one in Liz Truss. You had Boris Johnson, of course, Theresa May before her, and then we can go on back as far as you want to go. I think she's purposefully, and it's part of her character. Boris, good, bad, or indifferent, was a bit of a circus at all times, even when he was, even when you're doing something he liked, It was still a circus. I think she purposefully set a sober turn in her demeanor. Her first prime minister questions was very by the book, better matter of fact. It seems to me that she gets the moment. Does she really have a whole lot of options here? Because like you said, it's probably an overreaction right now. And you're talking, let's be honest, the stuff they're doing with this budget, this is wonky terms. This is tax rates. This is, marginal incomes. This isn't really good messaging stuff. And everybody's aware that winter's coming, and this winter is going to be hard no matter what you do. You already touched on it. Practically, there's probably not a lot of levers she has to pull here. What should this government be doing messaging wise to try to maybe get something out to the people? Because just talking about tax rates ain't going to hack it.
No, and the optics of doing a tax cut, whatever the merits of the policy, was appalling. Announcing a cut to the top rate of tax at this moment was an appallingly bad maneuver in terms of appearances to people on the street. But it's really, really insignificant. The cut to the basic tax rate costs far more, and Labour say they're going to keep it. The energy cap costs a lot more, and we're going to keep that. Everyone wants to keep some sort of subsidy for energy, otherwise people will simply freeze to death, given events. What needs to be the messaging, really, is that economic growth, which is what they've set out to do, is the only way out, medium to long term, of the decline that this country has seen, arguably since the end of the Second World War. It has been a century almost of decline, and what we need is economic growth. The top rate of tax cut was a bad decision in terms of optics. It doesn't actually change much economically. The message needs to be that we need growth, and also that people are going to be supported, because in the whole fuss we've had, people are completely forgetting the quite generous energy subsidies. And there have been all sorts of graphs on Twitter and in the papers which show that people on higher incomes benefit from the income tax decreases. Yes, that's true. But if you add in the very substantial reduction to people's energy bills, that completely flips it around. Because naturally, let's say you're doing very well, you're doing extremely well, doing $500,000 a year. Naturally, on a graph, you are going to benefit a great deal from the cut in 45%, going down to 40% of the top rate tax. But you're probably not going to notice the energy subsidy. Yet, let's say you're on £25,000 a year. Okay, you're not going to get a great deal of benefit at all from the cut in tax, but you will see a vast help from this energy subsidy. So there needs to be the messaging that we need growth, and there needs to be the messaging that actually there is help. Ignore what's on the news, ignore what the stock market does over the course of 2 or 3 days. Markets panic, people get on bandwagons. There's help and we need growth. That's what I'd do.
Ben Coach joining us. Longer term economic and much harder to deal with, though, is the things people do notice. They notice their food prices when they go to buy food and groceries and such like thing. They notice their housing cost prices, whether that be renting or mortgage or whatever the case may be. Those are things that are lagging indicators. Those aren't things you're going to be able to just, helicopter money, we call
Yes.
it economically. You're not going to helicopter money food costs. That's a longer term thing. That gets into some of the trade issues that the UK is having, that gets into some of the kind of baked into the state that the UK finds it. I know they're talking about it. Is there any actual plans in the works to do anything about it? Because it's probably too late for the winter, but going into the spring, going into next year, part of leadership is having not just an immediate plan because the voters are upset, but a long-term plan. Does anybody seem to have one?
Well, when you talk about rent, food prices, I think the honest thing, although I think if you're a senior politician, you probably shouldn't say this given how easily the markets do speak. The fact is that there is going to be a recession. It will probably last a year or two. It will not be isolated to the United Kingdom, and has precious little to do, actually, with Liz Truss's 2-week-long premiership. However bad a politician you were, you could not possibly have caused all that is coming to us. It would not be a popular line to deliver. And it's one I don't think politicians should deliver, purely because, again, markets spook. But the fact is that due to the war in Ukraine, due to a historic stupidity amongst European leaders, and by that I include the British, in terms of not taking up stuff like nuclear energy, and the very strong dollar that's causing problems in Asia as well, it's going to be really tough for a year or two. There are things that the government can do, but you cannot avoid what is going to be a global recession, probably, definitely a continental recession, for a year or two. Sometimes I think you just have to put your hands up and realize that it's going to be tough.
Would it be good messaging, Ben Coach joining us, for Liz Truss? You can't say it the way you just said it, because like you said, politics is marketing and branding. You can't say it like that, but wouldn't it just be good politics? Because there's no way this is going to have a good ending in the near term for her to just come out and say, look, this is going to be hard, because we've seen this with our own president on certain things. If you don't take some of the blame, if it gets better later, you're going to have a hard time getting any of the credit. Should she get out in front of this a little bit? How much honesty is needed for the moment? How much honesty is too much honesty with the I hate to use the term because it gets into economic stuff, but there's going to be some bad times coming soon. There's going to be some attrition here, just bluntly. How much should she take some blame now and just get in front of it? And how much truth is too much truth, do you think?
Well, I suppose the truth would almost be that her taking any blame would be a little wrong. As I've said, I think the real problems are structural. I think the real problems are historical. Should she be honest and say tough times are coming? Yes, but you also have to have a certain amount of optimism. There are very, very significant gains that a government can make in terms of our economy by deregulating, because we've got some very poor regulations that actually don't cost a penny. They cost the salaries of whoever is rewriting the legislation. We can do that, and it will have a certain effect, and it will have an increasing effect as the years go on. Really, if you're looking at her political situation, I think the trouble is she's got into the chair at the wrong point. We are 2 years away from an election. Do I think ultimately that some of the pro-growth messaging, but also measures that are hinted at in the mini budget, do I think they're ultimately the right path? Yes. Do they really need to be enacted over, let's say, a 5, 10, even 15-year time span to really have the effect? Yes. She's only got 2 years. It's a very, very sticky wicket, to use a cricket analogy, which may not be best for American radio, but there we go. I think that, yes, she needs to say times are tough. Yes, she needs to emphasize that the growth is what matters, and that there is growth. The British economy could be substantially bigger than it is now, and it would require very little government intervention. It actually requires the government to stand back and let businesses get on with things. But in the ultimate analysis, it maybe doesn't matter what she says. She's only got 2 years. She's basically sat down on the chair. The Queen has died, and now there's a recession. be careful what you wish for. Perhaps maybe it's maybe it's a very important tale for all of us. She's got the dream job, and I think it's probably too late.
Yeah. Now you said Ben Coach joining us. You're saying 2 years. Most of the people we've talked to in the UK, most of our contributors are there. They're like, in reality, she's got about 2 months to really make this thing work, to make her name on it, to kind of get a handle on this. She's got a very small window. She's got a very cantankerous parliament to deal with. Labor seeing their best numbers in decades, so they're licking their chops. She's probably not super sure about some of the folks sitting behind her on the benches because she's new to the job. Is this one of the tougher non-wartime premiership starts that we've seen? And put it in a little bit of context, just how steep a hill we're talking here.
Well, I think wars are a lot easier, bluntly, because the very worst.
I was an enlisted guy, not on my end, but I take your point.
Yes, for politicians, wars are a lot easier. Maybe I'll rephrase that. It's extremely tough, and I think that if she did pull off even a very slim majority at the next election, it would be a real comeback story, possibly even worthy of a feature-length film. It is very tough, and there's really no sugarcoating that can improve that. But I think it would be tough for anyone in that position, and whether that she may survive. Let's say they lose the next election, would she survive to fight another election? Probably not. But I think you've got to have a certain amount of admiration for her for trying.
Ben Coach joining us from London, UK contributor with Young Voices, sharp guy. Let's talk foreign policy, something that's kind of up your alley. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, the world keeps turning. That's just the way things are.
Yes.
The UK has some pretty serious foreign policy issues going on. Domestically, they've got plenty of issues like we just detailed, but even inside the domestic, Northern Ireland's a problem. They've got the Channel migrate problem. Wider than that, though, they've been getting credit for their support of Ukraine. You've done some writing, though. The Royal Navy, which, for a long time, the standard of the world and Britain's pride in a lot of ways, their national pride, not in great shape right at the moment. I know that seems like maybe a smaller priority to, food prices and stuff, but you can't be a world power without a world power military. And there's some cracks that are very apparent, and you've been writing about it when it comes to the Royal Navy.
Well, there are, and I think problems with your military, if you are indeed a sort of a global player, don't matter until they do, and when they do, they matter a great deal. And you've seen this with Russia. Russia, on paper, had a very strong military. Some said it was the second strongest military in the world after the United States. We've seen really what happens if you maybe have the numbers on paper, maybe even have the tanks or the artillery pieces or whatever. But if you don't have the right sort, and if you're not properly trained and so on, that means very little. Now, when you look at the Royal Navy, the training is excellent. A lot of the ships, they're modern. A lot of the radars, all the rest, and the fighter aircraft that we share with you, we buy the F-35 like you do, are excellent. So you might be wondering, well, what's the matter? The trouble is that we don't have enough aircraft we can fly off carriers, and we don't have the missiles to fire off them, and we don't have the missiles that we need to fire off our ships. There was a recent House of Commons sort of session where they described our Navy as a porcupine Navy, which is to say that it's more than capable of defending itself, but it has extremely little ability to actually reach out and attack. And that's the big problem. And that we'd see that was a problem if we go to war over Taiwan.
Ben Coach joining us. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. The American pullout made a mess. Our British friends stood with us through the mess. They carried a lot of that burden, frankly, honorably and very heroically, by the way. We've been allies for a long, long time. The special relationship, I look, my military service, we did lots of cross stuff with the Brits. I always enjoyed working with them for a lot of reasons. Not to mention that the Queen still let them drink deployed and we weren't allowed, but we'll talk about that some other time. But it's an amazing relationship, and one that both parties really enjoy getting to work together and serve together. We trust each other. I don't know that trust extends to the bureaucracies that manage our militaries. In the U.S., of course, there's the massive military-industrial complex. There's a lot of bureaucracy that's involved. For an audience that's not familiar with it, what is the state of the political and the bureaucratic part of the UK's armed forces, Whitehall? What is its standard? Is the bureaucracy the problem? Is it the politics of it? Is it the higher leadership? Because the frontline troops are excellent. I will attest to that personally. We saw them in Afghanistan. The bravery's still there. So the problem's got to be coming from the top, yeah?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And thank you for your kind words. And I know for a fact that British troops always think highly of the American ones with whom they train, alongside whom they fight. I don't think the problem really is necessarily anywhere within our military. The problem, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but history, both recent and more generally, hasn't been so kind to us. Since the end of the Cold War, and particularly after the financial crisis in 2008, the British Armed Forces received exceptionally little funding. Further, they were expected to operate in Afghanistan and Iraq out of their budget, which diminished it further. And yet another problem was that naturally, when you're having all those counterinsurgency operations, there's a very, very tempting thing to cut, which is the Navy, because you can't sail many ships in Afghanistan or Iraq. You instead want to be buying things like, Humvees, which can resist mines and that sort of stuff. So the trouble is that this shortage of missiles and aircraft comes not only from low spending, but the fact that for 10, 15 years, we were fighting with you guys in the global war on terror. So funding priority has been everywhere other than what you could call great power competition and the sort of naval forces you'd need for that.
Ben Coates continuing to join us from the UK. When you look at a military, though, having a military is extremely expensive. You have two concurrent events running parallel right now that I think will conflict with the UK people, because you have a cost of living crisis. So it's like, well, why are we spending money on a military and a cost of living crisis? But at the same time, they all watch what happened in Ukraine. It's like, okay, this is why you spend on a military, because at any given moment, some madman does something crazy and you really, really need to have a strong military. Those narratives are going to war with each other. They always have in the history of mankind. That's just how it is in the modern world. How does that play out in the UK, though? Because they're happening at the same time. Everybody's seeing both, but one of them's hitting your dinner table and the other one's hitting your conscience. Walk us through how that's landing with the folks in the UK.
Well, that's a very good point. Of course, belts are tightening and we also need to spend some more money on defense. I suppose your second point, that obviously Ukraine's been going on, I think very few people in our country right now would question the need for sensible defense spending. Obviously, it can't be a blowout, but the problems we have, particularly with regards to the Royal Navy, are not that expensive to fix. They're not cheap, nothing in defense is, but they're not that expensive. And I think with the world as it is now, with the invasion of Ukraine, with rising tensions over Taiwan, I don't think it'd be politically too hard to sell to increase defense spending by 10 or 20%, which ultimately would not leave us with an outrageous, egregious outlier in terms of our defense spending. It would actually be very easy to get that money and more if we cut our foreign aid budget. The foreign aid budget is probably the juiciest, biggest slice of government spending cake that there is, which very few people in our country would actually object to rowing back on, given circumstances. Whether there's a political will or nous to do that, I don't know. But the money that we need to correct the problems I've identified is there just about.
Yeah. Ben Coates joining us. One more question on the foreign policy front. There's long been a sense that there would be trouble in the Commonwealth when the Queen died. that has happened now. There seemed to be a lot more steadiness than I think some people, maybe a lot of that was overblown. There are a few places, though, the Caribbean, other places that are starting to talk about it. Is that an issue in the UK? Are people thinking or talking about it? Is it a back burner? Is it just media noise? Talk to us about the current state of the Commonwealth and the future of it.
The Commonwealth is, I think, for some people, an emotional attachment. But I think that attachment is largely limited to those who would be very interested in politics and maybe those in government. The man in the street, as it were, has extremely little interest in the Commonwealth, less interest still if someone in the Caribbean doesn't want King Charles as head of state. It really doesn't matter to us. I suppose it's as blunt as I can be. Monarchies continue, that's the nature of monarchies, and so King Charles has been widely accepted, and there's been a lot of sympathy even on the personal level. You may not be a monarchist, but on a personal level, obviously the gentleman's lost his mother and has had to parade for days and days and days on end before, without wishing to be crass, his mother's body was cold, and so on a human level there's a great deal of sympathy for him. There's no threat to the monarchy in this country. It will continue for decades, really, probably centuries at least. I think it's probably something which is going to go on and on and on. Whether it continues in Australia, whether it continues in the Caribbean, really, I think that's a matter for Australian or Caribbean politics. It's not the talking point here. Commonwealth simply has extremely little relevance to British politics and British daily life.
Yeah, Ben, Coach, let's loop back to where we started, something that has a lot to do with your daily life, the current economic crisis at hand. Look, politics is a minute-by-minute thing. You can go crazy chasing, especially if you're over here trying to pay attention to a foreign country's politics. Give us a couple big picture things to pay attention to over the next couple of weeks, whether it's a policy thing or just the general messaging. The pound's way the lowest I've ever seen it in my lifetime. I can't believe how low it is. Give us a couple things that we should pay attention to, so when it does break through our news feed, you go, oh, okay, that's one of those things I need to pay attention to that's going on over there. That's an indicator I need to watch.
Well, I suppose one of those things would be how the market behaves after this shock. I think it's been a panic, and I'm not an expert in economics by any means, but I think just today the pound went up to, I think, was it $1.10? Where it had been on a low, I think 1 3 cents. So already we're seeing a bit of a recovery. That would, what I would say, be an important thing. Does the panic that we've seen over the past, few days really carry on over the next few weeks or months? I suspect not. As I said, it's going to be a recession. It's going to be a recession on the Europe-wide. It's probably going to be a worldwide recession. There is not going to be a tremendous amount of economic good news for the next few years, as awful as it is to say. But I think one of the things you'll see is definitely the markets coming to their senses a bit and realizing that nothing in that mini budget or anything else is some strange outlier. It's really economics, as usual in the grand scheme of things. There's nothing that should cause any level of panic. As to a second thing, well, I think our politics really is buried in the cost of living stuff now. I think the second thing more generally, I don't think we were directly involved, but a second thing more generally, I think, to watch the news is how this Nord Stream pipeline stuff transpires. It seems to be the perhaps the world's highest stakes game of Cluedo or something. It's a murder mystery. Who blew up the pipeline? It seems to be in no one's interest really to do this, other than perhaps the United States, but that would obviously be an extremely rash course of action, blowing up, allied pipelines, so to speak, something they're shared between Russia and the rest of Europe. I just, on a purely personal level, fascinated. I'd be fascinated to know what was going on there, because it really you'd think it was not in the Russian interest. They can simply turn the pipeline off. I don't know why they blow it up. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, when irrational things involve people that have already proven to be irrational, it's hard to deal with it. I have my theories. We'll keep them to ourselves for right now because we're talking UK politics with our friend Ben Coates. Love talking with you. Great information. Appreciate it. Kind of sounds like y'all just need to print a whole bunch more runs of those steady on shirts. Is that kind of how it feels right now?
yeah, I think that sort of attitude will get you a long way.
Yeah, it's almost a cliche, but at times like this, also a lot of good wisdom in there. Ben Coates, enjoyed your insight. Appreciate the time. We'll get you back. Until we see you on Heard Tell again, though, let folks know where they can follow you, what you've got going on. We're going to link to 2 different pieces he wrote, one on the Royal Navy, another one on the Conservative Party. That's an interesting window from about a month ago where things have changed a little bit. It'll be fun to come back and
Yes.
see how well you did with that.
Yeah, I think any articles predicting political events and polls and such are, probably foolish.
Yeah, tell me about it. I got one floating around out there about how Biden shouldn't be president, but here we are. Part of the gig, my friend, part of the gig. Let folks know how they can follow you and keep up with you until they hear from you again on Heard Tell.
Well, I'd stay glued to your radio station because I'm far too clever to have any Twitter accounts or anything like that. So don't worry, you won't have to hear any of me more, and you don't have to read any of the rubbish I put out.
He does have a Young Voices page. We'll link to the pieces. Make sure you read them in full. They're very, very good. He's playing it down. Sharp guy. Enjoy talking to him. Got to get you on Twitter, man. It's more fun out there. You get all kinds of.
I'm on Twitter, but I'm too clever to put my name to it. I'm too clever to post.
Yeah, I had a great one yesterday because I took a run at Patriarch Kirill and got the Russian bot farms after me about how I need to be eaten by the teeth of the dogs and that kind of fun stuff. I actually tweeted it back out. So there's mess on there, my friend. But that's why we talk to good friends like you, people of good faith, and we hash things out. Ben Coates, thank you so much for the time today, my friend.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on, Andrew.
Yeah, do it again soon, sir. Thank you. Welcome back. We are talking economics with our friend Joseph Politano. We are using housing as a thread through a lot of different stuff here because housing is the most expensive thing for most people. There's a stat that you have in your latest Apricotos blog that, well, it's a Substack. I shouldn't say that. The Apricotos Substack. This blew my mind. North Carolina now permits nearly as many housing units as California. North Carolina has a third of the population of California. And that's a shocking statistic when it comes to housing.
Yeah. And I think it should speak to how absolutely terrible California's housing shortage is and how little they build compared to basically any other place in America. They have 40 million people and they build like as many as, like you said, North Carolina and South Carolina, about the same number. So we're talking 8,000 permitted units a month versus like a little over 7,000 in North Carolina. Those numbers, bounce around pretty frequently. But the point is like, yeah, there are some parts of America that just do not build anywhere near the necessary amount of housing. And the other critical thing to think about in California is like, it's not just they don't build enough housing, it's that there's basically no supply response in total. So if you look at like since 2017, the pace of home building in California hasn't moved. And if you've talked to anyone in California since 2015, you know that prices have gone up, you know that rent's gone up, you know it's gotten more difficult to live there. And there isn't this response of, even if you're not building enough, you'd hope prices go up, you'd hope more suppliers enter the market, you hope more construction happens. That just doesn't happen in California. And so we're talking about that, like the outlet valve is Phoenix, but the other thing is eventually it becomes a competitive advantage to try to move whatever you can out of the most expensive areas just to save on cost. It's hard to employ people in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, because it's so expensive. Very much like a Yogi Berra. Nobody goes there because it's so crowded, Nobody wants to live here because it's so expensive. But it's true that you see people moving out because of the prices. We're in a situation now where like the Texas and California, Texas alone builds twice as much as California. And Texas has 10 million people less. Florida builds functionally as much as California before the pandemic and now significantly more after. And that's like crazy. And so if you want to talk about where the economic growth is in this market, where the actual construction is, it's not in these like really big cities anymore. It's not in California, which I think is sad, because there's lots of people who understandably would want to live in California, and there's a lot of problems that develop when you don't build for the amount of demand there is in the state.
Yeah, and let's break this down for folks. There's a reason housing is such an important economic indicator. When you build a house, and the number varies a little bit, but it's something like 25, 26 separate trades go into building one single house. So that's dozens and dozens of people that are subcontracting. That's on top of the dozens and dozens of people it takes to build the home. That has entire supply chains behind them. Building a home is a huge economic ripple. That's just one home. So then when you get into these areas like a Raleigh, where they're building them by the hundreds at a time, that's a huge pipeline of economic activity, not just for the home buyers and the home sellers, but all the tradesmen, the contractors, the inspectors. Then you have the secondary folks, the termite inspectors got to go look at the house, right? Things you don't even think of. There's so many tentacles to the housing market of building homes. So when you stop building homes, that's why it's such an indicator of economic activity. And when you're building a ton of homes, the reverse is true. And that's why you, as an economist, that's why you watch that number so tightly, isn't it?
Yeah. And if you're thinking about like how do people feel about the economy, it has a lot to do with housing markets. How confident they are depends on what the housing market looks like, and vice versa. More confident people are more likely to go out and say, I'm willing to buy a house here. And the interesting dynamic that we're talking about here, where like people move from Los Angeles or New York to these other places, that only happens when people are very confident about their economic state. Because you're talking about moving halfway across the country, try to buy a house, get a new job. You got to be in a really good place to make that bet. So that's a really important economic indicator, and I think it says a lot about the U.S. labor market. Putting aside the work from home trend, that we just had this supercharge of people who were confident enough to move across state lines, in 2021 after the initial pandemic shock.
What's the economic indicators for interstate movement? Because people love to use those numbers. They use them in a political sense, like, oh, look, everybody's moving to a red state. That some of that's true, but there's other things. LA is always going to have people moving to LA because it's LA. It's got built-in stuff. Then you have, blue enclaves in red states, like in Austin. Are those numbers really viable? We use them politically and talk about people voting with their feet and all that. But those kind of numbers can also be a little misleading because, like you said, we don't have one. This is a great line, by the way. You ought to trademark it. We don't have one housing market. We've got 10,000 little housing markets, and every one of them has their own little story. How do we parse that out? Because that's look, we're going to see that headline again. Every time we have an election, we have that headline of everybody's moving to the red states, everybody's fleeing the blue states, or vice versa. How do we parse through that with some actual data and numbers? Because, yeah, it's kind of true, but it depends.
Yeah, it's really hard. So unfortunately, there's the thing you learn in this business is that whenever you want a data point, it's going to take 5 years for it to be published, and then nobody's going to care. So like the most comprehensive stuff comes from the IRS, because people have to file their taxes. So if you move, at any point during the year, and you're filing taxes from a new location, the IRS catches you. But they don't publish that until years after the fact because, to protect people's privacy and to give them enough time to let everybody file. What we can look at is like the Postal Service address changes. So people are calling the Postal Service and saying, hey, I'm moving from here to here. Can you change my address? Can you forward my mail? That saw the big upturn in 2021. My friend Paul Williams has done some really great research on this, talking about the places people were moving to and the supply responses or lack thereof in some areas. So, lots of people moved to Boise, lots of people moved to Montana, lots of people moved to Denver. These like mountain lion cities, I like kind of cute way to call them. Those places built maybe a little more housing, but it's not a lot. It's really, a lot of these places in the South, and in particular Texas, I think I really can't understate how crazy it is, the amount of housing that gets built in Texas. But yeah, I think it's hard to say like what policy is driving this beyond the housing prices are cheaper. Because if you're looking at it too, it's like people are moving to Texas, but they're mostly moving to Austin, Houston, Dallas, the suburbs thereof. So are these people who are more conservative? Probably not. It's probably more so people who just couldn't afford what they were at before, people who are maybe lower income Californians who are moving out of the state. I think that's less a political statement about California and more of an economic statement about the specific housing policies in California and in Texas. Like, I think if you had, maybe Austin is a possible example of this happening in the future. If Austin inherited Los Angeles's housing problems, people would leave it for the same reason. Austin builds a lot more than Los Angeles right now, but it's possible. And I don't think there's anything from the state government in Texas, except for the fact that they're willing to preempt local zoning a lot more than in California. It was a long-winded way of saying this, but when we think about people moving, we think about people like searching for new opportunities. One of the favorite things I read from Professor Leah Bustan in her book about immigration economics is if you look at immigrants to the US, they earn more than Americans over time. And the reason for this is not because they are, innately special or you're self-selecting the best and brightest purely from these countries, but actually because when they get to the US, they go, okay, what's the biggest opportunity place that I can move to, And if you're in America, you're born in America, you have some ties to your local area. Moving is really difficult. I've tried it a few times. It's not fun. People understandably don't want to do it that often. And so if people stop moving, across the country, economists get worried about dynamism. They're saying, okay, well, if people are stuck where they are, that's not good for long run economic growth. That's not good for people's wages. That's not good for ingenuity, investment, and so on. So, the idea that people are moving again is, I think, very important.
Joseph Politano joining us. Did we learn anything? Because we're getting away from the pandemic now. Like, you just made the crack, and you're only half joking. You're saying, like, well, it takes 5 years to get the data point out that you really need. We're not 5 years from COVID yet, but we're far enough from it now that we're seeing what the bounce back's going to be, give or take. The service sector is still weird. We have really weird stuff in the economy. We have, like low unemployment and a labor shortage at the same time, just stuff that on paper shouldn't exist. Have we learned anything? And break it into the two parts, both the economist and just the average person, because those are two very different things. I know we all went through it. I know it was loud. I know we all had some pain, but did we learn anything?
I think so. I think, it's hard to write history as it happens. It's hard to forecast. It's especially hard to forecast in the middle of something like this, in the middle of a pandemic. I'm hopeful that the institutions are going to come out of this a little stronger than they went in. I think the big lessons, if you were to put like in all capital letters, was that the economy was stronger than people expected in maybe late 2020, early 2021. I think there was a very reasonable fear when the pandemic hit, that we were going to have a repeat of the 2008 crisis, which took like a decade before growth came back. Still is leaving permanent scars on our economy. Was talking about millions of people permanently out of work for years. That kind of stuff was a nightmare to people. So everyone pulled out all the stops to try to prevent that. Across the world, I think central banks and central governments underestimated the strength of the overall economy because things were so weird during the pandemic, and because we had never had this happen where a modern economy has to interact with these kind of public health issues. And so I'm hopeful that that leads to a little more understanding of what the indicators mean I'm hopeful for the general public that, we talk about this like rational inattentiveness model in economics. That's one of my favorite things because it explains so much. It's like if something doesn't matter to people, if something isn't affecting people's day-to-day lives, they don't pay attention to it. And then once it does, they pay attention, they learn, and hopefully they carry that information to next time. I think you saw it with inflation, where lots of people were not worried about inflation. Now we're very worried about inflation. Hopefully, I think learning more about what it means and what it, how it happens and what can be done to fix it. I hope that people get a greater understanding of the labor market. You made that comment about like, how do we have a labor shortage, and unemployment is so low. It's like, well, there's two sides to the same coin here. If companies are struggling to find workers, it's because workers' bargaining positions are so high. It's because you have such a strong labor market. I'm hoping people appreciate that a little more, and I'm hoping that people can now recognize what a better future labor market could look like.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.